Good afternoon, and welcome to this afternoon of gathering to remember and to honor John Stamper. We're going to begin with a prayer that is offered by Father Berlin from Rome.
He's muted.
Okay, let me start again. Sorry. These little details trip me out. Almighty Father, we ask that you bless our proceedings today. Send forth your Holy Spirit, that we who pray for our brother John may celebrate the graces you have given us through him. Grant him salvation, comfort us in our grief, and help us to celebrate his life. May we emulate his virtues, as all virtues come from you, are of you, and lead to you. We ask this through Christ our Lord.
Should we maybe ask them to repeat it, or?
Father, can you hear me? Father Berlin, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Would you please offer that prayer again? We were completely muted on this side and we did not hear you. I think it's important to refer to your apologies. This is probably the last COVID-related complication we'll have in the school. I promise.
Okay, so we're in mutual communication.
We are, indeed. Thank you.
Okay, what does it say? Unmute.
He's back.
Okay, I'm getting all these weird messages. Okay, are we back in sync?
We can hear you, that's fine. Yes.
Okay. Almighty Father, we ask that you bless our proceedings today. Send forth your Holy Spirit, that we who pray for our brother John may celebrate the graces you have given us through him. Grant him salvation, comfort us in our loss, and teach us to celebrate his life. May we emulate his virtues, as all virtues come from you, are of you, and lead to you. We ask this through Christ our Lord.
I would like to begin with a few words of remembrance of John. I've been here for 1.5 years as dean, and we shared a suite in the dean's office, but we didn't see each other very much because there was very little contact between people during the pandemic. It was a very tough and a very trying condition to be both teaching and leading the school under. But one thing I did know for the time that we spent together, and that is that we were actually members of the same generation and were taught by the same kinds of teachers. And what kinds of teachers were we taught by? Those were teachers that belonged to two camps, by and large. They were both young modernists and old traditionalists. And this mixed education that we received explains a great deal about where we all got and what we all did and are doing. John's research and his interest in classical architecture is probably indicative of his connections to this educational path that he received. His interest in urbanism as well. Just in late October, he had shown me a paper he had written to the mayor and the director of planning commission of the city of South Bend to protest the decision to tear down the urban renewal instigated best buildings in the city. And he said very simply, I think as a 21-year-old, I think it was a paper he had written for college, that that buildings should not be taken down without new buildings being designed in their place. So the decision to remove was a superficial one, and of course he was not heeded. He did not receive approval for this kind of suggestion, but he was absolutely right. When it came to his teaching, our generational histories and experiences weighed here deeply as well. We were very much educated by people who believed in commitments of the kind that John applied and worked on his entire life. His courses were expansive. He educated a huge number of people through this school. He was on the battlements every day, and we had a very unusual experience, of course, of losing him halfway through a year, and the response of emotional response of his students to this loss was completely overwhelming, in part due to the contact they had with him and what they had gotten from him during the first semester here. And lastly, on the question of service, this generation did not ever step back from having to do the right thing. And certainly over 30 years, the history of the school has been one in which a number of very distinguished individuals have done an extraordinary amount of work to bring the school into a certain kind of prominence, as you know, that has been particularly surprising initially, but now deeply understood and deeply appreciated by not only people in this country, but also abroad. And certainly the deans during this period of time bear a lot of the credit for steering the ship, but the 18 years of John's associate deanship speak loudly as well about the kind of pillar of a person he was and the kind of credit he deserves for where we all are today. Lastly, I would like to remind you that schools are certainly about the university in which they belong to in this country, about the general traditions and curricula that come and go and evolve through the years through them. They're about the students that are taught here, the staffs that service the students and help in every aspect of the organization of an institution like this. But fundamentally, I think they're about the teachers who spend extraordinary amounts of time, their entire lives, in fact, leading students through values, virtues, materials, and service commitments that mark their lives and mark the direction of the institution for years, for decades, and into the centuries. In the last months that John was alive, he came to the school every day, and he attended to his duties across the board without ever shirking any of them. He was 100% there until the last 3 days of his life. And my impression of him during this months was that he really wanted to be embedded into the school, that he wanted to belong here, that his spirit needed to be among us. And I think we need to take this thought seriously and to be thinking about the fact that those who served here continue and will always continue to be part of this extraordinary school and institution. Thank you.
I had hoped to give this little bit, this reflection from the roof of our building so we could have the Coliseum in the background. So because of John having spent a decade as director of the Rome Studies program, but we're having thunderstorms, so that seemed imprudent to do that. So I have the Pantheon in the background. In the novel, about 2/3 of the way into the novel Anna Karenina, somebody says something clever, and Anna observes, that's not only clever, it's true. Aha, so there's a difference between something being cleverly stated and actually being true. And the irony is the novel begins with an observation, very clever, about happy and unhappy families, which I consider utter nonsense. Every politician and every advertising agent knows that a clever phrasing can add an air of substance and veracity to a thin and even erroneous thought. And I bring all that up because once I saw some publicity for a conference on teaching, which took on one of those clever but idiotic phrases, and it said, "Those who can do, those who can and can explain, teach." Teaching is not the lesser part of an art, it is the greater part of an art. To be able to do the art and also explain it is a higher calling. And I think of John Stamper very much in three ways as an exemplar of that idea. John was an architect who could explain architecture and who could explain it and lead people through it in a way that was very complex, that entertained an enormous number of considerations and taught the students to do the same. For many years, he offered a high-rise studio, which validated the claim I always made when I was showing, back in the days when one of my jobs was showing high school students around the school and explaining the curriculum and so on. And one of the points I would make is that a training in traditional and classical architecture teaches you lessons that will carry you through any kind of architecture. When you understand scale, proportion, urban response, the relationship between structure and technology, and so on and so forth, because you've learned it when it was at its through the richness of tradition, then you can start thinking about other things. It is a foundation, not a limitation, as some of our critics might say that our curriculum is a limitation. And his high-rise studio very much validated that our students trained in traditional building and building typologies could take on another typology and learn lessons from it that reinforce what they had already learned and applied it. So John, as an architect, not only knew the art and could do it, but he could also explain it. As a scholar, John could and did do exemplary research and writing and publication, and mentored many students in their pursuit of that as well. From small things like writing an academic paper to large things like launching a career in scholarship themselves. Either of those would have been a life's contribution to the art of architecture, but together they are, they build on one another. And then the third one is kind of the art within the art within the art, like a babushka doll, where you keep opening it and finding a new one inside. In the art of teaching, John was a teacher of that art as well. When I was on committees with him, when I was working on the curriculum, when he was associate dean and I was assistant dean for undergraduates, I understood how deeply he knew the art of teaching and knew the art of crafting the curriculum in such a way that it was always for the good of the student, not just the immediate good in the classroom, but for the lifelong good of how they would proceed as architects. So he was a master of the art of architecture, a master of the art of scholarship, and a master of the art of teaching. And in all of those, he not only could, but he could explain and did. And for that, I remember him as one of my greatest models of what I wish I could do in my own way within the school and within the world. So I think of John as a true exemplar of the truth behind this idea that those who can and can explain, teach. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Fortunately, Mark White is unable to be with us today, as originally planned. His longtime business partner of 30 years, Kevin Havens, has graciously agreed to speak in his place. John Stamper invited Kevin to his design reviews on many occasions and admired his work, his knowledge, and design acumen. Kevin Havens is an executive vice president and director of design for White & Company in Chicago. He's responsible for overseeing all the creative projects, primary focus on architecture for education and justice, and the planning of complex institutional campuses. Kevin earned his Master's of Architecture from Harvard and his Bachelor of Science at Iowa State. And he's licensed both as an architect and interior designer in Illinois. Please join me in welcoming Kevin Havens back to Notre Dame. Kevin.
Thank you, Michael, and greetings and good afternoon from Chicago. I feel a little bit like the stranger in the room. I've met many of you, both here on campus and in Rome as well. But you know me only vicariously through Mark White, who has been a true and dear friend of this school. And as Michael's explained, today I am serving in his stead. And I can tell you that it saddened him not to be here in person. As many of you may know, Mark too is struggling with his own cancer challenge. He's doing well, his countenance is high and prospects look very good, but he was too exhausted to join you today. So he asked me to come and share some remarks. But more than just a surrogate, I too had a relationship with John Stamper as well, through the studio reviews that Michael had indicated. So with your permission, I'd like to share two reflections on the impact John had on my life, and then I'll conclude with Mark's. They're very different kind of reflections because we had a different kind of relationship. But with that, I'd like to share some brief thoughts. I met John Stamper over 10 years ago through his friendship with Mark White, both sharing a long-standing and fond relationship with the University of Notre Dame. John was an impressive guy right from the start. He extended genuine hospitality on my first visit to Bond Hall, touring me through the public spaces, the design studios, and certainly that remarkable library. He gave that stoic building a sense of place by demonstrating a sense of warm welcome and compassionate engagement. As we became acquainted, I was honored to be invited to join his high-rise design studio as a final review juror, both in Chicago and South Bend, over several consecutive years. I recall being most impressed by the quality of student work produced, but even more taken aback by the strong relationship that John had uniquely built with each student through his investment and commitment to every project. You see, it was clear that each student mattered to John. Every project, even if not brilliantly executed, was treated respectfully and given equal consideration with others' classmates' work. I remember one presentation in which a particular student expressed uncertainty regarding his own adventurous design solution, particularly the development of its expression, and even doubting the validity of the very parti. He didn't even complete all the required drawings and was clearly downcast by his disappointment in not meeting his own expectations. But what the student didn't realize was how completely committed Professor Stamper was to the value of his underlying concept and to champion those worthy ideas to full resolution. Instead of a trouncing critique, John delivered an uplifting review of a very good project that was just clearly underbaked. Not false praise for bad work, but insightful reflection on the unrealized potential of a truly creative solution. That student and his classmates were inspired that day to see the power of a strong idea revealed through empathetic eyes. But that was exactly the quality of teacher and mentor John Stamper was to all of his students. He possessed a kindness that never translated to easy acceptance of subpar effort or sloppy thinking, but rather a firm intellect that inspired one's highest effort and the freedom to take chances. It was a refreshing example of leadership in our too often mean-spirited world. My periodic association with John over the years influenced the way I approach practice today. I think of him often when leading design workshops with clients or reviewing the work of younger colleagues in our office. Channeling John's approach, I find being generous and open to new ideas to be liberating, but always balanced by his unyielding standard of nothing less than rigorous evaluation. You see, associating with John was like being in an ongoing master's class in guiding aspiring designers, shaping their minds and skill sets along with their character. Thank you, John, for your inspiring example. You are sorely missed. And then I'd like to go on and conclude with Mark's reflections, which he asked me to share. Donald Pope Davis is a good friend of my partner, Pat Cermak. It was Don who introduced me to Dean Michael Lukutis many years ago. Michael and I had lunch at the University Club in Chicago, and he asked me about possibly lecturing in Jed Eads' professional practice class, one which continues today with Professor John Meller. Many years later, Esther and I are now committed members of the Architectural School Advisory Board, which has become a very important part of our lives. But before I met Jed, and right after I met Michael, I met John Stamper. John made a point to seek me out and to make me feel welcome and comfortable in this land of academia. My friendship with John grew immensely each year. Early on, he agreed to speak at White & Company about the evolution of tall buildings in Chicago. Imagine a Notre Dame professor delivering a lecture about towers and modernism. What a privilege. There must have been over 85 people for that first lecture, and John graciously refused an honorarium. Around the same time, John was reaching out to my longtime partner, Kevin Havens, about participating on a jury panel for John's high-rise studio. John and Kevin soon built their own friendship, and I am so grateful that Kevin is here today with you. Well, the friendship with John soon moved forward to include Erica and Alessandro, facilitated by my most French hobby restaurant, Tony Patisserie and Cafe on Washington Street near Michigan Avenue in Chicago, where Alessandro worked. It was a favorite of Erica's too. Pretty soon, connecting together around food became a regular family affair, with John's family joining ours on Thanksgiving. John would say grace, followed by a blessing from our resident rabbi. It was such great fun. In my 34-year partnership with Kevin, we've been blessed to meet some wonderful people who have become part of the fabric of our lives. John was one of those people. John was quiet and soft-spoken, but as the saying goes, when he talked, everybody listened carefully. I've never met a smarter, kinder, more thoughtful, or more considerate man. John was one of a kind, and he'll be sorely missed. I paid attention to how John dealt with his cancer. Now that I am faced with this same struggle, I pray I can find half of his courage and half of his grace. John Stamper is my hero. I will miss him and remember him fondly. Mark White.
Now we'll have some words of remembrance from Rick Kobus, a longtime friend of the Stamper family, and John. So, Rick, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure. Can you all hear me? Okay. It's a pleasure to be here today, to be able to share a very personal reflection on John's life and our friendship. I practiced architecture internationally for more than 40 years, and I met my good friend John 50 years ago. We were both studying architecture at the University of Illinois. As architecture students are prone to do, we spent many long hours in the studio well into the evening. It was here that I first learned of John's thoughtful approach to architecture and his deep interest in the history of architecture. We shared that interest. We came from very different backgrounds. I grew up the son of a builder and developer in the Chicago area. John grew up on a farm in Mishawaka, Indiana. yet we shared very similar attitudes and values coming out of the turbulent anti-war era of the late 1960s, as well as a passion for architecture and a deep belief in its power to transform lives and to enrich the human experience. We shared an apartment as roommates in our junior year. I learned that John had no interest or skill for cooking, while I loved it. My creativity on meals was often met by his less than enthusiastic reception. I remember introducing him to his first artichoke. He simply couldn't fathom how one could find culinary delight from a vegetable so hard to eat. Let's just say that John, at this point in his life, was a very traditional meat and potatoes kind of guy. I'm glad to hear that he advanced to French cooking later in his life. One summer, John enrolled in a summer studies program at Harvard University's Graduate School of Design and returned to regale me with stories about his experience at Harvard, in Cambridge and Boston, and the many characters that he met. Those stories must have had a deep impact on me because as we neared the completion of our undergraduate studies, I began leaning more and more towards graduate studies at Harvard. John encouraged me all the way, believing that the design education I would get there was unparalleled. John visited me in Cambridge during my first year at Harvard, then joined me in Massachusetts when he decided to study art history with Charlie Cunningham at Williams College. Although we were quite literally at the most distant ends of the state, we managed to stay in close touch and visited as often as our studies would allow. It was on one of those visits that I had the great fortune of first meeting Erica Pistorius. As I got to know Erica, it became clear to me that John had met his life's companion. A few years later, I was honored to stand as John's best man in their wedding in Williamstown. Our lives took very different paths as I remained in Boston and founded my architectural practice, and John headed back to the Midwest and then to Notre Dame. We kept in touch. John visited me in Boston, and soon John was heading the Rome Architectural Studies program for Notre Dame. That was a great bonus for me. He invited me several times to come to Rome in the spring to serve on the end-of-year design juries. But the real bonus was in first meeting Alessandra as a toddler, and then a few years later, speaking the most melodic Italian I've ever heard. Those were such great memories. But through the many years, we enjoyed a bond founded in our friendship and in architecture. I visited South Bend from time to time. John invited me to sit on a panel on the creation of a university research park at Notre Dame. My firm competed for a few architectural commissions at the university. And John, Erica, and Alessandra traveled to Boston to witness my marriage to my second wife. I will always treasure John's intelligence, modesty, and compassion. I know what a deep loss he is to this community and to you both, Erica and Alessandra. I too will miss his gentle smile, quiet wit, and soft-spoken but still powerful voice. I celebrate his life, his contributions to our profession, to his students, and to the intellectual firmament of our field. I will miss you, John.
Thank you, Rick. I would like to begin with an adaptation of the words that have long been associated with the American postal worker that I believe fit this occasion. Neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor gloom of night keeps John Stamper from the swift completion of his appointed rounds. I can think of nothing more fitting than that phrase. Over the 30 years that I have known and worked with John, his remarkable ability to do everything in front of him, teaching, scholarship, administration, above all, devotion to family, in sickness and in health, was a powerful example of how one person can leave their mark on the world they leave behind. I first met John when I applied for the position here at Notre Dame in 1990. In the fall of 1991, when Thomas Gordon Smith hired Samir Yunus, Nadia Al-Hassani, and me, he made sure that this relatively large cohort of new professors could be introduced to the faculty members who were already here. Thomas took us for a 2-day retreat to Jonesville, a small Michigan town with Greek Revival and Victorian neighborhoods. Since the bed and breakfast was small, we all had to have a roommate. The lottery for rooms took place, and the draw brought John and me together to be those roommates. It was a great way to meet the faculty, and John and I hit it off brilliantly from the very beginning. His steady and kind demeanor put this new and relatively young faculty member very much at ease. Over the 30 years, I've acquired a few stories. They may not be exactly as I say them, as our memory darkens over time. But even if the facts aren't right, the essence is. John, at the time, had been assigned to Rome as the director of the program. Erica took her turns in helping out Romana de Ferrari, the sole other administrator, and looking after the students as well. Their daughter Alessandra was to be born in the Eternal City, and I can remember the bus rides. But the students would take great glee in passing Alessandra to the back of the bus and forward again, in Notre Dame football tradition. Back to his Rome assignment and to the phrase about John not letting anything keep him from his appointed rounds. In 1990, John arrived in Rome to a not-so-friendly former director of the Rome program. This former director actually had the audacity to lock John out of the building. Of course, such antics do not deter John from performing his duties. He immediately set up an auxiliary office at a nearby cafe, fortified, I'm sure, with the best espresso he could find. And from this cafe, he communicated with Thomas and campus until, as was inevitable, he prevailed and the former director repented and relinquished authority. Such challenges never deterred John from executing his responsibilities. In the 10 years that he was director in Rome, there were many challenges: administration of the program, taking care of students, planning field trips, managing the curriculum, and working on his own research. There were many other wobblers that were thrown at him throughout his time in Rome, such as the time during the field trip to France, when a student removed a radiator from a hotel, only to be found out when the bus had traveled to the next town. Despite the messy situation, John took it all in stride and managed to calm down the hotelier and the police who had caught up with the bus. Due to John's great negotiating talents and abilities, the story had a good ending, and the students continued on their field trip without further delay. John's ability to work calmly under fire was a great contribution to the school during his time as associate dean and throughout his time as a professor. I personally relied on his advice, his never-ending commitment to make sure all the I's were dotted and all the T's were crossed. He would religiously travel with me to ACSA administrators conferences and attend all the accreditation seminars so that we had two interpretations of what we had seen and were able to decipher the sometimes confusing or contradictory information we would receive. His knowledge of the accreditation process was second to none, and the school and I remain indebted to him for several accreditation cycles. During his time as associate dean, I would often ask him to let go of some courses or administrative duties, but he always refused, cheerfully taking all of them on, all while conducting his own scholarly activities. Before he went to Rome, he had already written his book on the development of North Michigan Avenue in Chicago. And after he returned from Rome, he published his book on the architecture of Roman temples. Just as in his ability to juggle a wide range of tasks, his ability to link the new world with the old was an essential part of his being. John's interest in Chicago's modernism also led him to rekindle the traditional fourth-year high-rise studio project reformatted for the fifth year. The importance of that studio was not so much that high-rise model for cities and their buildings had validity for every place and culture, but rather that the school would participate in that conversation about high-rise buildings throughout and around the world. The beneficiaries, of course, were the students, who enthusiastically signed up for the coveted 15 or so places in the class. John traveled to Beijing and Hong Kong to attend the international conferences in tall buildings, and he brought some of the most well-known architects to lecture here at Notre Dame because of those trips. And together with Pete Noon of Salman Cordwell and Wens, he also prepared the way for a partnership with a firm that you will hear more about today from both Pete and former students. Through his belief in the instrumentality of history, he was able to link the past with the present. His book on the Roman temples and his courses and studios, precedent is the operative word, that allowed him to see the various approaches to architecture and appreciate how they in turn inspired the design process. His students benefited from his lectures and critiques, as did his colleagues, I being one. John's enthusiasm for all that was before him gave him a tireless energy that allowed him to make extraordinary contributions to his colleagues, students, and all who were part of his life. Especially in the later years, our work together, his resolve to do everything and do it really well, that never waned. The last time I saw him, he was still working hard, determined to finish his last book. This was the real John. This is why I began with the postal worker's motto: neither rain, nor snow, nor heat, nor bloom of night keeps John Stamper from the swift completions of his opponent. Thank you, John. Thank you for all you've given to the school and to me personally. We will miss you deeply. Thank you. And now, my pleasure to introduce Stuart Cohen. Stuart Cohen has a long history with the issues that are important to John Stamper's formation as an architect and teacher. His essay, entitled "The Tall Building Urbanistically Reconsidered," has been on the essential bibliography of the school here at Notre Dame since it first appeared in the second volume of Threshold magazine in 1983. Its reconciliation of a modern building type with traditional urbanism makes it a timeless piece that every student of architecture should have read by the time they enter the third or the fourth year. Stuart Cohen has made a seminal contribution to architecture on the national level. In the 1970s, he and 6 other architects joined forces to revive Chicago's architectural culture by staging exhibitions and symposia. The group, consisting of Stuart Cohen, Tom Beebe, Larry Booth, James Freed, Jim Nagel, Stanley Tigerman, and Ben Weiss, called itself the Chicago Seven, after the 1960s political radicals. In 1991, he and his partner Julie Hacker founded their firm Cohen and Hacker in Chicago, and later moved to Evanston. The firm's work has been published in national and international journals of architecture and received awards from Progressive Architecture, Interiors Magazine, and the American Institute of Architects. Stuart Cohen was selected for inclusion in 40 Under 40, and in 1979, he was chosen to represent the United States at the Venice Biennale. In 2007, Cohen and Hacker were recognized by Residential Architect magazine as one of the 50 top residential architectural firms in the country. As an educator, Stuart Cohen was a faculty member at the University of Illinois, Chicago from 1973 to 2002, and is currently a professor of architecture emeritus. He's been a visiting professor and guest lecturer at universities throughout the country, including Notre Dame, Columbia, University of Pennsylvania, and Harvard. His work as an academic and practitioner no doubt contributed to John Stamper's way of thinking about cities and buildings. John's interest in high-rise buildings and the traditional cities in which many of them are located was directly influenced by the ideas that were circulated by Stuart and others in early stages of their career. Stuart Cohen holds a bachelor's and master's degree in architecture, where he studied at Cornell with Colin Rowe. And before returning home to Chicago to open up on architectural practice and teach, he worked in New York with the firms of Richard Meyer and Philip Johnson and John Burdette. In 1985, Stuart Cohen was elected to the College of Fellows of the American Institute of Architects for his contributions to architectural design and the profession. Please join me in welcoming Stuart Cohen back to Notre Dame.
What can I say? Like most architects, I have nothing to say without pictures to show at the same time. How you doing there? Okay. I could just begin. Well, can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
I could just begin while we're, oh, okay, well, we do have images, but I have some remarks before we get to these. Michael, I want to thank you for the lovely introduction. I sent you a brief biography that was about a quarter of that length, and I must say that that your introduction actually makes me feel old. I should talk into the mic since it's recording. I'm really honored and touched to have been invited here today to honor the memory and the scholarship of our friend John Stamper. I have a long association with Notre Dame dating back to the 1980s, which is when I first met John. Bob Amico, former dean here, had asked Norm Crow, who's speaking here today, Stephen Hurt, who went on to be dean at Maryland, and myself, if we would start a second professional program or second professional degree here at Notre Dame in architecture. We were all, as is Michael, graduates of Colin Rowe's Urban Design Studio at Cornell, and it was the ideas from Rowe's studio that Bob Amico wanted us to bring to Notre Dame. Further, over the years, I was an occasional juror at John's high-rise studio back when he held the project reviews in Chicago. At the time, I never realized that my article on the urbanism of tall buildings was required reading for his students. So at Michael Lakudis's suggestion or request, I want to reprise the material from that article in honor of John today. I had somehow imagined that that the audience would be a mixture of colleagues, friends of John's, and students. So I'd like to preface this with some of this maybe things that you already know, because in part it's addressed supposedly to students. And then I hope some of it is things about tall buildings that you've never really thought about before. I'm going to read my remarks tonight because Michael asked me if I would speak for 20 minutes, which for those of you who really know me know, given my penchant for anecdotes and asides is challenging. So having said that, I'm actually going to read my remarks, which is something that I try not to do. But so to begin, the tall building and the City of Towers as an image of the city has been tied to various depictions of utopia. These include the Gothic towers pictured in the background of the Ghent altarpiece, the Adoration of the Lamb, shown here on the left. The towers in the background are generally understood to be the New Jerusalem. The image of towers on the right, in this case church spires, appears in the frontispiece of August Pugin's An Apology for the Revival of Christian Architecture. These references are not tailored to my current audience, but are to suggest a connection between the biblical New Jerusalem, utopia, and images and symbols of places of heavenly ascent, such as mountains, as well as ziggurats, pyramids, which were favorite motifs, I might point out, for the tops of early 20th century skyscrapers. We tend to think of the skyscraper as a 20th century phenomenon. Its enshrinement as an image of modern utopia is surely Le Corbusier's Ville Contemporaine, which is the plan on the left-hand side. Le Corbusier's 1925 plan for Paris, shown on the bottom right, drops the Ville Contemporaine, cruciform towers, and blocks of courtyard apartments into the historic center of Paris, and one might note, destroys it all. The post-war emulation of Le Corbusier's towers provided not only anti-urban to the very idea of the traditional city as defined public spaces, streets, plazas, squares, and even parks. The same utopian image of the city, the symbol of post-war World War II, corporate America, the high-rise tower, becomes the freestanding skyscraper with open space at its base, here epitomized by New York's Seagram's building of 1958. However, Hagman and Pete's 1922 Compendium of World Urbanism, the American Vitruvius, an architect's handbook of civic art, suggested in its section on American urbanism that, quote, the intelligent use of the skyscraper in civic design will be America's most valuable contribution to the civic art. The book's frontispiece shows New York's municipal building, designed by William Kendall, a partner in the firm of McKean, Mead & White, and built in 1914. So on the left, we can see a view looking down Chambers Street. The building's freestanding colonnade, which we can see on the right-hand side, holds the face of the street, and the giant arch actually allows Chambers Street to pass under the building, leading to the approach of the Brooklyn Bridge. At a larger scale, the exedra shape of the building and the central tower receive the space of Chambers Street at the scale of the city, while the colonnade that we see here on the right actually define the pedestrian entry space to the building. The idea that a building can be both figure and ground, that is, an urban wall defining the space of a street or a plaza, and an object building was suggested by Colin Rowe and Fred Coder's discussion of the Church of San Ignazio in the Piazza Navona in their 1978 book, Collage City. For me, this seemed to suggest that a skyscraper's base could be part of an urban wall, again defining the street it's adjacent to or a plaza, and that its upper floors could be seen as a silhouetted object providing a romantic profile when seen from a distance. This is a description that fits many of the skyscrapers built between 1910 and 1930. And here, my favorite anecdote is the first time I went to New York City as a architecture student. I went looking for the Empire State Building and could not find it. I finally had to go into Grand Central Station and find the street address. And then when I got there, I realized that it was only the building I was looking for above the 20th floor. So moving on, we can identify a number of specific roles a skyscraper can play in traditional urbanism. Paired with another building, it can form a large-scale gateway to a portion of the city. And here we're looking at Michigan Avenue and a view of the Monroe Building on the left and the Athletic Club on the right, both buildings by Holabird and Roche. In architect Andrew Rubori's plan for the development of North Michigan Avenue, which at that time was a residential street called Pine Street, you can see that at the bridge crossing, and again, when this was done in 1915, the bridge was projected but hadn't been designed or built, there are a pair of towers acting as gateposts. We can also terminate the visual axis of a street or center an urban space. Left-hand side, we're looking at the Board of Trade in Chicago, and then of course on the right at Rockefeller Center. So in Chicago, at the heart of the financial district, which we're seeing on the left, the south end of LaSalle Street is unique in a grid city. It's a street that terminates on a building. So before the current Board of Trade building was built, the street ended in the old Board of Trade building designed by W.W. Boyington. It opened in 1885 and terminated the view down LaSalle Street in a 240-foot high tower in the purloined images that belongs to the Getty on the left-hand side. So before the old Board of Trade building was taken down to be replaced by a much larger building, 2 bank buildings were built just south of the Board of Trade site on either side of the end of LaSalle Street. On the right-hand side, or the west, the Federal Reserve Bank by Graham, Anderson, Probst, and White was completed in 1922. And on the left, the east, the Continental Illinois Bank building was completed in 1924. Both buildings are by the same firm, which is kind of an unusual thing to have happen. And in an interesting urban move, the architects fronted the street with two-story classical entry porticos facing one another. The rendering that we see on the left is Graham, Anderson, Probst, and White's proposal for a new building for the Board of Trade, which proposes terminating the space of LaSalle Street in a 3rd classical portico. The commission for the Board of Trade was awarded to the firm of Hollenberg and Root, and was completed in 1929. The Board of Trade's design seems to be based on, am I missing a slide in here? Well, we'll see if it comes up. Anyway, the design to me has always seemed to be based on Bertram Goodhue's entry on the left-hand side for the 1922 competition for the design of an office tower for the Chicago Tribune newspaper. Goodhue's design, which we see here, drops away the corners of the thing and accentuates that center into a pinnacle. Unlike if the Board of Trade maintains the corners, drops away the center, and acts to receive the central axis of the street in a kind of exedral shape, much like the municipal building did in New York. Further suggesting that the architects are paying a kind of homage to the Goodhue design is the cap of the building, which is a pyramid, and the Tribune was topped by a sculpture of Mercury, the messenger of the gods, and in the case of the Board of Trade, by Ceres, goddess of grain and the harvest. Here's a slide that I thought we were going to look at a moment ago. And in these 2 slides, you can see the opposing porticos. And what's really interesting is that not only do they establish a strong cross axis, but because the porticos are built up to the lot line, it means that the mass of the tower is actually set back. And what it's always seemed to me is suggested here is that LaSalle Street, rather than terminating solely on the face of the Board of Trade building, actually ends in an implied or suggested urban space at the foot of the street. So my favorite confluence of Chicago skyscrapers is the one built between 1920 and 28 at the Michigan Avenue Bridge crossing. And any discussion of the history of these buildings owes a lasting debt to John Stamper's research and his 1991 book, which Michael mentioned, Chicago's North Michigan Avenue, Planning and Development 1900 to 1930. And unlike Rockefeller Center, a masterpiece of Beaux-Arts axial design, which was all planned at one time, the skyscrapers at the Michigan Avenue Bridge were an incremental work of urbanism in which all the architects, rather than sharing a commission, shared an idea about the design of cities. In his groundbreaking book, Design of Cities, the author and planner, Edmund Bacon, includes the idea of the second architect. Bacon suggests that if you are not the first one to build in a place, there's a moral imperative to consider, respect, and respond to the existing character of that place. This is what the architects who built at the Michigan Avenue Bridge crossing all did. So the Michigan Avenue was built in 1921, and before that, North Michigan Avenue was Pine Street. Pine Street was a residential street that existed as such until 1915. And one of the important things to see, sorry about this, I don't have a laser pointer, is that Michigan Avenue and Pine Street don't align. And I think that's really important for understanding what's happening in the space of the bridge crossing. And then on the right-hand side, we're looking at North Michigan Avenue as a street of fancy residences. Okay. In 1912, Michigan Avenue property owners formed the North Central Business District Association, which commissioned various architectural plans for the development of North Michigan Avenue and for the site of the proposed bridge crossing. Each of these proposed renderings that we're looking at are by Andrew Rabori, whose plan for all of North Michigan Avenue, or the development of that area I showed before. These drawings were done between 1912 and 19, and they all show paired towers forming a gateway and a forest space in which the axial shift of the alignment between Michigan Avenue and Pine Street could be resolved. Okay, so we're looking here again at the rendering of the Rabori image we looked at before, and then the way in which, well, I don't think it's bright enough to show up on your wonderful gigantic monitor, which I love. But anyway, you can see that all of these schemes try to adjust that by bringing North Michigan Avenue and South Michigan Avenue into a space which is treated as an oval to kind of adjust that axial shift. And what's interesting in the Rabori scheme is look at the way in which the building on the west, on the left-hand side, angles away just slightly with respect to trying to resolve that space. So the first major building to be built north of the Chicago River was completed in 1921. Actually, it was completed before the bridge was built. And it was Graham Anderson, Probst & White's Wrigley building, built for the chewing gum magnate, William Wrigley. It's, as you can see, a tall block that angled back parallel to the bend in the river and created an open plaza. And I think you get in this old aerial view a real sense of the way it's addressing that bend in the river as well as the space of the bridge crossing. Obviously, the bridges had been built by the time this photograph was taken. And then two more views of the splayed face of the Wrigley building. So the next building was built along the south side of the river, and it was the London Guarantee and Accident Company, completed in 1923 and designed by Alfred Altschuler. And that's the image that we're looking at on the right. So it's a neoclassical building. It's topped with a circular lantern. And I've always thought that its curving front is there to kind of suggest that, in fact, there is a space, even though it's not terribly well defined, at the bridge crossing. And of course, it's topped by a neoclassical tempietto. So the idea that the bridge crossing and the spaces created on either side are a gateway condition comes across clearly in this rendering of a few years earlier by Edward Bennett, who was one of the authors of the 1909 Burnham and Bennett plan. Reason you may not know that is it's generally referred to as the Vernon Plan for Chicago. And the drawing shows not only the completed Wrigley building, but a proposal for bridge towers. There are 4 towers, which you can see. And those were actually built and as designed by Bennett. The drawing is, of course, titled New Gateway to Greater Chicago. And interestingly, and this is where it'd be nice to have a laser pointer that worked, but if you look at what Bennett suggests for the site of the London Guarantee Building, it's a building that extends along Wacker Drive, but actually curves ever so slightly, again, in response to an acknowledgement of the importance of the site. So in 1922, the Chicago Tribune's publishers announced an international competition to design an office building to be built on North Michigan Avenue in front of the Tribune's existing 2-story printing plant, which you can see off to the right in the left-hand image. The Tribune asked in this competition brief that people consider the Wrigley building and design what would be the most beautiful office building in the world. So the Tribune received hundreds of entries from all over the world, ranging from the winning entry, a traditional Gothic tower designed by Howells and Hood, seen on the left, to Walter Gropius's exposed concrete tower infilled with Chicago windows, which I'm not showing you. But I've always thought, and I think there's a lot of agreement on this, that probably the most impactful of the designs submitted was the second place entry by Eliel Saarinen, which we see here on the right, which I think had a great impact on the design of skyscrapers in the following decades. As an aside, if any of you know the New York Daily News building, newspaper building, it's deco and simplified, but it's vertical bands and setbacks very much like the Saarinen project. And as an interesting aside, it was built by James Patton Medill, who was McCormick's partner and had been pushed out of the Tribune company several years earlier, and then moved to New York to start the Daily News newspaper. So there's Ribori again, and I show this because it's important to understand that the Tribune is a point tower with 2 exposed faces, and that it really marks the transition from the space of the bridge crossing to North Michigan Avenue as a spatially defined corridor street. And I've always thought that Ribori's towers, if you look carefully at them, in many ways foreshadow the design of the actual Tribune Tower. And perhaps it was the hope, somebody's hope, that the site just north of the Wrigley building and exactly opposite the Tribune Tower would someday have a second building that kind of matched it in bulk and in height and actually formed the kinds of gateposts that Ribori has been suggesting. So I think that perhaps the most enigmatic of the entries to the Tribune Tower competition is certainly Adolf Loos's proposal for a building in the form of a Doric column. And to me, the only explanation of this has to do with the fact that Loos was living in Paris at the time, that he had spent time in Chicago and would have understood the urban nature of the site, and that what he's doing is recalling C.M. Ledoux's designs for gatehouses at the Place de la Nation in Paris. And then just for the fun of it, this wonderful photo montage of the Loos Tower. So completing the final corner of that site is the 333 North Michigan building by Halliburton Root of 1927. And that's, of course, the thing that looks like an almost impossibly skinny point tower on the left-hand side. And what the building actually does is it extends south along Michigan Avenue as a slab building, and it's only the end that is extended up like that. But what we can see, if we look at the Noli style map, and again, north is up, so this is the 333 building here, is that it is exactly on axis with the view down Michigan Avenue, and that view, of course, terminates in that elegant and, you know, vertically extended building. Okay, so if we look at that space today, you can see Mises Illinois Center building, the Equitable building by SOM, which is set back and creates, you know, way too big a space, and then the Glass Apple Store Pavilion at the river's edge. Okay. So, given the state of the environment and global warming, there are serious questions about whether we need to build more skyscrapers at all. But assuming that the practice continues, we should consider the determinants of skyscrapers' form. Today, these seem to be structural, often coupled with, hey, look at me, formal gymnastics, and the desire to make something unique for the purposes of corporate branding. This rationale has produced a variety of twisting, gyrating, and cantilevered forms. Given the freedom of formal choice, these buildings seem to suggest the idea of vertically differentiating a tower using the specifics of its form to respond to its urban site seems an eminently arguable starting point for a skyscraper's design. Thank you.
Thank you, Stuart. Pete Nguyen is the managing director of the Sullivan Cordwell Wenz San Francisco office, where he's responsible for the office's overall operations and management. As partner, he sits on the firm's finance, operations, and building technology committees, providing leadership and direction to the firm-wide operational process. Pete played a seminal role in John Stamper's interest in teaching the high-rise studio. Pete and the Chicago offices of Sullivan Cordwell Wenz generously shared their expertise with John's students for many years. In addition, the pedagogical contributions of the firm have provided fertile ground for Notre Dame architecture interns and graduates to find employment, and thus contributing to their professional lives as well. John would often express to me his deep gratitude for his friendship with Pete and participants in the firm. Pete received his Bachelor of Architecture from Notre Dame and holds a Master of Architecture from the University of Illinois at Chicago. He leads the firm's university outreach and recruiting efforts and serves on the National Documents Committee of the American Institute of Architects. Joining Pete Nguyen is Jackie Oberlander. She is now an associate at SCB, Sullivan Cordwell Wenz, and a former student of John Stamper's in the High Rise Studio. She received her Bachelor of Architecture degree here at Notre Dame in 2014, along with a minor in sustainability. It was part of the Glynn Family Honors Program. At SCB's Chicago office, Jackie works closely with clients, consultants, contractors, and regulatory agencies. In her 7 years with SCB, Jackie has collaborated on a number of large-scale projects around the country that include locations such as Philadelphia, Houston, and Atlanta. She's also active in the firm's residential research and development group. We wish to extend our thanks to Pete and Jackie and the entire team at SCB for their nurturing and participating in the High Rise Studio and all of the graduates who have passed through its offices or are still there, which allow them the opportunity to discover their place in the profession. John was very proud of all our graduates at SCB, and I know that his contributions as a teacher continue to inspire them long after graduation. Please join me in welcoming Pete Noon and Jackie Oberlander back to campus.
Well, thank you, Michael, for your kind words. And I think much as in your remarks, a lot of it's probably not true, but the sentiment is well founded. And like Stuart, I'm actually going to read some things because when I try to speak off the cuff, I get nervous and I forget what I'm going to say. So I'm going to read some, and then I'm going to try to speak from the heart. You know, when Jackie and I were asked to do this, the first thing I did was write down words that I could use to describe John. And, you know, the people that have come up here before me have hit upon a lot of those themes. John was an incredibly kind and warm person. He was certainly caring about his students, probably as much as any teacher or professor that I ever dealt with. But the first thing that comes to me and affects me personally is the word mentor, because I had the opportunity of being John's student a long time ago. When his first year here at Notre Dame, he came here as an adjunct professor, and I remember, you know, he was like one of us because he was a young guy, and you know, much of my vision of my professors were these very learned gentlemen that had been around for many years, and not that they were old, but they certainly had wisdom that had come from long years of practice and teaching. And John was pretty much right out of school, so he felt like another one of us. And that first year, he had a bunch of us over for coffee to try to pitch the idea of going to graduate school. That was in 1981, and those of you that were alive then might remember, there were no jobs for architects back then. So graduate school was a pretty attractive option. But he invited us to coffee, pitched the idea of graduate school, but in a little bit different way, and I think it foreshadowed some of the way he taught later, and certainly the High Rise Studio. But he really encouraged us to go to schools where practicing architects were teachers. UIC was one of the ones that he mentioned, and it was an opportunity that came my way, and actually affected my life in a big way, because I went to UIC. I met a lot of practicing architects. I learned from a lot of practicing architects, and that led me to my firm, and then ultimately years later circling back in the High Rise Studio. So that was, I think, probably the first thing that I thought of, that idea of mentorship. And I think that John, when he pitched that idea of going to a school where practicing architects participated, he was thinking that we needed exposure to that. And we had 4 years, 5 years at Notre Dame in academia. And I think he realized that exposure to the practice of architecture was a good thing for students, and that we would benefit greatly from the contacts and certainly the knowledge that practicing architects would bring to a school. So the other thing, or another theme that seems to have made its way into everybody's words so far about John, is that how much he cared about students as an individual. And I think that was probably something that struck me as much when I was participating in the High Rise Studio as when I knew him here. But so now I'm going to read because I'm getting really nervous. But so when I was first exposed to the High Rise Studio, my first impression was that it was overly kind. And I was talking to Stuart before today's event, and brought up something that Stuart witnessed with me twirling quite precariously from the end of a rope in a studio where we had to give do a debate with another student in my class. The winner got an A, the loser got an F. It wasn't a very kind studio, and I think it brought out, Stuart didn't remember it, but I, by the way, did lose the debate, so 15-1, actually, so. But I thought that was, it was kind of an interesting thing, is how kind it was, and even with little golf claps at the end of each presentation. You mentioned the one student that hadn't finished their work. I mean, over the years, I witnessed a couple of things like that, events like that, where students hadn't finished their work, or perhaps were unconfident, or lack of confidence in what they had produced. And what struck me is John really tried to drill into what each student was trying to accomplish with their project. There was no, it wasn't about John. The studio wasn't about him at all. It was about the students and what they brought to the various projects that they designed. And I thought that was maybe the second thing that I thought of, first mentor. Second was his interest in the students as individuals, and how that later affected me in the way I approached things as a professional.
In the High Rise Studio felt that, sorry, I'm gonna topple this over there. Always made a point, as Pete said, to really approach every project from the student's perspective. Not his, not the jurors. He truly wanted each student to develop their own passion and to explore that own passion through the studios that he created. In a sense that it created such a diversity of design, as you can see on the walls around the room here today, that some of the students would take that in a much more contemporary direction. I was more in that camp where I wanted to explore. Others would really hold that classical style, and his vast knowledge and history of architecture really allowed him to critique and guide each of us through that process as well.
I think another aspect of the studio, a little bit less about the way John ran it and more about the changing world, was the diversity of the studio. When I first started at Notre Dame, I graduated with some of the first women that came to this university. There were not a lot of minorities in my class. And the diversity of the student body in today's world is so much more enlightening, and so much, it's just better in a lot of ways. But it brings ideas to the design studio that wouldn't have been explored back in my day here. And that's something that I think carries forward and when we start to talk about the partnership that my firm had with John and the High Rise Studio.
And just to add to that, along with those same lines of the encouraging and the diversity, he also encouraged that in how we approached our projects in terms of the technology that we use, and incorporating that vast amount of technology from the watercolor to the CAD to the rendering, whatever direction the students wanted to explore, he was open to, and he would help us learn what we needed to do to approach our goals, whatever those may be. He was just so invested in each student's success.
I think that you could refer to John in a lot of ways as a bridge. He was a bridge builder. I won't go so far as to call him a pontiff, but he was certainly a bridge builder. And the first, bridge that he built at this institution was when he started. This was a school that was in large part focused on modernism. Le Corbusier was probably one of the biggest influences on me as an architecture student. Certainly classical architecture was important. We went to Rome, we saw all those things. And as students, we were kind of interested in incorporating elements of classicism in our work, which unfortunately ended up very postmodern looking and not very skillful. But John, with his knowledge of the development of a high rise in Michigan, the high rises and the development along Michigan Avenue, as well as his study of classical Roman architecture, I think really helped him bridge that change that happened at this institution quite successfully, actually. And the high rise studio, he was able to allow students to explore. They used what they had been taught for 5 years or 4 years here at this institution in classical architecture, but allow them to expand as they saw that they wanted to. Again, he was treating them as individuals, but he was able to speak the language from any sides and help guide the students through their projects. And so that the classical architecture and the high-rise studio, they weren't, the one was not a foil for the other. They were actually part of the same program, which I thought was quite spectacular on his part.
And just to add to that, as a student, the partnership with practicing architects through that high-rise studio and the feeling that the projects we were working on really were grounded in programs that, in my case, the SCB had worked on in the past, and ability to have our crits with actual practicing architects and get out and tour the site and be in the offices was really a unique and inspiring experience as we started to explore what we really wanted to transition to and grow to as we went into our final semester as students here at Notre Dame.
So let's maybe talk a little bit about the partnership and the way I see it. There were really 3 huge beneficiaries to the high-rise studio that John did. First, from my standpoint, I benefited, but my firm benefited, the profession benefited from the exposure to the students. I think there was also a benefit to this institution, and I think most importantly, there was a huge benefit to the students. I can speak to the benefit to the profession since that's what I experienced, but again, we talk about, go back to 1981, that coffee that John had, encouraging us to go to school where we would be exposed to architects in practice as part of the curriculum. And in a way, this is sort of turning that on its head and exposing us as practicing professionals to the ideas of the students. And I thought that was something that we benefited hugely from. So it was an opportunity for me to do something besides manage an office. I hadn't really participated in design in quite a few years. They didn't let me do that anymore. And it was an opportunity for me to meet students and really engage on a different level than I was used to doing every day. But I think what was really interesting is the voice that I heard. As a practicing architect, and this was in the early 2000s, I was working on a lot of high-rise buildings. I was working for clients that looked just like me, for buyers that looked just like me, and there wasn't a lot of diversity in what we did. And I was all of a sudden exposed to a very diverse student body that brought a whole different background and a whole different way of looking at high-rise buildings that would foreshadow what my firm does today, which is really designing for a newer generation, a new, more diverse generation. And so we got a lot of questions about why do you do that? How do you do that? And it made us really have to rethink a little bit about what we were doing, because people that were from again, a different background, different way of looking at things, didn't necessarily see the way we were designing as clearly as we thought that it might be. So that diversity actually made us think and grow as professionals. I also think that the idea that the high-rise studio brought students into our office was hugely important. I will freely admit that as intellectually stimulating as the studio was, there was an ulterior motive. I think Professor Lakutis mentioned that I was heading up, at least at the time, our recruiting efforts. And I had been trying to get our staff to get back to the schools they came from and contribute, participate, but get to know the students and find the brightest and best students. So this was a great opportunity for me to meet firsthand some of the brightest students that come out of this program and introduce them to our office, the way we work, not necessarily to actively seek them out to get them to come to work for us, but hopefully the seeds were planted. And so going back to what I said before, where buildings that we were designing were being designed by John and Pete, Gary, Steve. They're now being designed by Jackie and Ava and Kelly and Maddie in our firm. And I think that's a huge testament to the high-rise studio. And that we have, Abdallah and Iwe and Kruti working for us, that we would have them today, but we would not have been exposed to that level of thought and diversity of thought as quickly as we were, except for the ability to work with John in the studio.
All right, from a student standpoint, the high-res studio was so important to us as students, as it created an opportunity to truly bridge between that academic world and into the practice of architecture. I always felt like that was such a passion for Professor Stanford, and he tried to instill that in all of us. It also truly gave us a chance, as others have noted, to build on the classical basis that we've all learned during our first 4 years at Notre Dame, and really take that to either continue in a classical direction or choose to explore an alternate, more contemporary approach, or kind of an alternate design style that we might choose. And the way he approached the studio truly encouraged each of us to gain in our own personal confidence in our design, in our thought process, in ways that I know I personally and so many of us carry into our day-to-day work as we go forward. Professor Stanford was all about encouragement. I remember in studios, he wouldn't do much sketching. He would always just come around, wouldn't solve the issue for you. He would just ask you the questions to guide you in the direction, to help you to think through the solution on your own, and tie right back to that creation of confidence in ourselves. And if you were on a roll, he would check on you, and swing on by and come back later, which was pretty unusual. And I truly, truly appreciated that in both the high-rise studio and my thesis studio that I also had with Professor Stanford. But he was just so truly committed to helping all of us in the best way he could to achieve our goals. He always made himself available and always went above and beyond to not just answer your question, but explain and teach in the process and make sure that you weren't getting that boilerplate answer. You were really understanding why and the how of each direction there. And as so many have noted, he was always highly encouraging. no matter what direction we wanted to go. I'm sure he thought some of them were crazy, but he encouraged each of us to develop that passion on our own and truly gain that confidence in ourselves. He also truly encouraged us to explore who we wanted to be as an architect, and particularly in the high-rise studio, working in that different building typology with those different construction types. It truly afforded that opportunity for each of us to dive into that passion for ourselves, see if high-rise architecture was something we were interested in, or if we wanted to pull right back into that more classical and potentially small-scale realm, and just continue to push each of us to develop that confidence in ourselves and explore that style and develop that confidence in our design ideas. And in those ways, he was a wonderful mentor to each of us, especially based in his broad knowledge, as so many have noted, of the more contemporary styles, of the classical, of the Roman, of the specifics of Michigan Avenue in Chicago. He could speak to us on so many different fronts and really critique and assist us in any direction we chose to pursue, both during school, and he had a genuine interest in what each of us were going to do and what we were going to pursue after school. You know, some of the most passionate conversations I've personally had with him, I was considering bouncing around a little bit after school, and he was insistent that I stick with architecture and not step away from it, even if it was just for a year. And that's one of those things that has truly stuck with me to this day, about just making sure each of us were really striving to reach those goals. And talking to one of my classmates a couple of weeks ago, she quoted that she truly felt his goals were always to gather everyone's passions and encourage them. We've already touched on this, I know, with several people, but he truly encouraged us to find our voice, be it aesthetics. His huge knowledge base and passion were inspiring for us to see every day. Just walking around Chicago, I remember him just expounding on the beauty of the curtain wall system at 333 Wacker. It's not a building I had ever looked at before, but now every day when I walk past it, or I guess not quite every day, but once a week or so when I walk past it, I always think about Professor Stamper and his is just tied to the beauty of architecture of any form. And he, through that vast knowledge, he was able to help and guide and advise any student in any direction they wanted to go. And truly taught those of us who wish to explore outside the classical realm how to stay grounded in those wonderful classical principles while exploring alternate aesthetics at the same time. This is specifically an example from my thesis studio, but I was working on a project that was more in the contemporary realm. Classmate behind me was working on something that was Disney based. We had others who were working on very classical libraries, parishes, various different items in our studio. And he took the time to really learn what drove each of us, learn what we each really wanted to get out of that project and display with that project, and did everything he could to help each of us pursue those in our own way and in our own direction. And he truly encouraged each of us to make our own decisions while just gently guiding us and making us go through that critical thinking process on our own. He also truly wanted us to be prepared for that transition into practice, and make sure that we had that quote unquote real world experience. And I think he used that high-rise studio to really champion that, both by teaching us his wonderful knowledge of Michigan Avenue and the various components of Chicago, but also giving us a chance to travel to Chicago, be critiqued in an office by Pete and other principals who truly practice in those building types every day. When we first went to Chicago in the fall, we were able to tour SCP's office, see how their office was set up, get a visual for how many buildings they were working on, look at some of the maps showing the influence that that firm in particular has had in downtown Chicago. And then also tour a high-rise residential project there. I had never been inside a residential high-rise project at that point. So to be able to truly see those in practice and understand what we were working on and designing, and learn about that from those who were practicing in those fields was an incredible learning experience. And obviously guided a little bit of what I do today now. He also encouraged us to really think outside the academic sphere. I think I spent more time in the library during my high-rise semester than I did any other time while I was at Notre Dame. And that was particularly because we had a full CD drawing set of Legacy Tower, which is an SCB building just off Grant Park in Chicago, in one of the files in the basement. So to have that reference, that you could go down, you could check against the program, say, I'm dealing with this issue. Ooh, how was this solved in reality? How was this solved and shown in a CD set? Again, really helping us to bridge that gap and build from that knowledge that we've learned at Notre Dame and start to really think and transition into that practicing architect role. I mentioned we had crits with the principals at SCB. I know we also had crits with those from the Council of Tall Building and Urban Habitat, which again just lended to that wonderful exposure that he was so determined that each of his students would have. And in talking to others in our firm here, I know one of the things that I heard again and again was that one of the great important aspects of this project, both as students and then as a growing learning experience for those students as we went out into the practicing world, was that we were able to take an entire high rise, which now is a 6 to 8 person team to complete, from completion to high rise, and essentially do the entire work of that team on our own, which at the time I didn't think much of, but at this point, looking back on it, truly gave us a incredible understanding of all of the decisions and all of the processes, the vast array of thoughts and considerations that need to go into creating a building at that scale. And coming in as a young architect definitely set me at a very strong starting point to understand what the whole team needed to be doing and what the collaborative efforts needed to be to get these the size of these buildings up off the ground. And just tying again to the uniqueness of the studio. I was back a couple weeks ago for the career fair here and speaking to some of the students about how I was first introduced to SCB. It was just wonderful to see their eyes light up when we talked about having our crits at SCB and actually being able to tour and learn from those who create these buildings in practice every day. And it was one of those things that I guess I hadn't thought back on in a long time, but it was just wonderful to see and just see what an outstanding experience that was as a student. And all the credit to Professor Stamper for really driving us forward to that point. Then to just expand on that a bit further, he also encouraged us to truly explore any different styles and tools in visual communication, excuse me, throughout the studio. So we were encouraged to design our own aesthetic direction, but not only that, but also design with whatever tools we wanted to. So in my studio alone, we had people working in Revit, watercolor, SketchUp, Photoshop, hand-drawn sketches. And with his vast knowledge and vast history, he was able to come around and critique each of us and really give us the guidance and insight that we needed to truly help push forward and help teach us those software, or not necessarily teach us those softwares, but teach us how to develop the best product using whatever software that we were in. And I'm sure Ava can touch on this more later, but in future years, he even brought in past students to help teach specific softwares and how those softwares could be used specifically toward high-rise development. Again, just tying to that passion he had for making sure his students were excelling to the best of their ability. And finally, he just gave that opportunity to explore even beyond the tools themselves, but also in the way we presented our building. It was never a tie to a plan, section, elevation. He wanted us to go through that critical thinking process and really think through how is your building best represented. Again, showing his passion for the students, growing amongst themselves and growing with their own ideas, as well as growing toward a professional practice where you're truly making those decisions on your own every single day. A bit of a quote from one of Kelly Summers, one of our fellow employees, who was also loved Professor Stamper dearly. She wanted to sound along and say that he was a genuinely kind human being who was invested in every student's success. And as a student, that's something you carry with you. She says, I've forgotten many past professors, but not John Stamper. And she goes on to say the Hi-Rise Studio truly allows students to see the entire picture, allowing them to be most effective working in the larger collaborative. And then a couple of final thoughts on my end here. Just his passion for encouraging students to pursue their own passions was inspiring to all of us. And it felt like he was constantly a driving force in the Hi-Rise Studio and in other studios I had with him, just to ensure that each of us were developing into the architects that we truly wanted to be and that we could be most successful in. And along with that, just preparing us for that transition into practice that we were quickly becoming only a semester away from, and encourage those own critical thinking skills and design confidence in a way that I know still benefits me every day that I work in the office today. I'm eternally grateful for Professor Stamper and all he taught us.
Thank you.
I think I am. Hello, my name is Marianne Casado. It is my honor today to read an essay written by Dennis Dorden. Dennis is an inspiring educator. He is an amazing scholar and historian, and an especially collaborative and wonderful colleague who is unfortunately unable to attend today. Before his retirement, he was our Associate Dean of Research, Scholarship, and Creative Work here at the school. So it is my privilege to read this essay. John Stamper and the History of Chicago Architecture and Urbanism by Dennis Dorden. Scholarship endures. Sadly, scholars do not. We miss our friend and colleague, John Stamper. Good scholarship is timeless. Although the intellectual climate of the discipline may change, good scholarship weathers change and continues to contribute to the general understanding of the subject. However, good scholars, and John Stamper was a very good scholar, are part of their particular moment in time. Their work reflects the concerns of their particular place within the history of their discipline. This is clearly the case with Stamper's contribution to the history of Chicago architecture. In the first half of the 1980s, John Stamper studied the history of architecture at Northwestern University under the tutelage of David Van Zanten and Carl Condit. He received his PhD in 1985. His PhD thesis was published 4 years later by the University of Chicago Press as Chicago's North Michigan Avenue Planning and Development, 1900 to 1930. It is important to pause for a moment and consider the way the history of Chicago architecture was thought about in the early 1980s. Historians and critics were interested in two things. One, Chicago's contribution to the development of the steel-framed skyscraper, and two, the contribution of architects like Louis Sullivan and Frank Lloyd Wright to the development of a distinctly American vision of an organic architecture. One focused on structural engineering issues and studied things like the development of building foundations, the shift from load-bearing wall to a skeletal framed structural systems, and the articulation of curtain walls. The other focused on the careers of Sullivan and Wright, along with a handful of their contemporaries, and positioned them in the intellectual history of American exceptionalism. In this reading of history, Sullivan and Wright defined themselves in opposition to the tradition of historically inspired architecture. Concrete and steel replaced stone and wood in terms of a material understanding of architecture, and nature replaced history as the inspirational model for a truly American architecture. John's mentors at Northwestern, David Van Zanten and Carl Conduit, made seminal contributions to this version of Chicago's history. For reasons that go beyond the scope of this event, postmodernism was late in arriving in Chicago. In the early 1980s, the discussion of architecture was still framed largely in terms of modernist set of values. In this modernist version of history, Chicago's Columbian Exhibition of 1893 was an unfortunate chapter in the history of, in the story of American architecture, an architectural dead end in the march of progress. The arrival in 1938 of Ludwig Mies van der Rohe to the head of the architecture school at ITT was interpreted as a reaffirmation and updating of the true spirit of Chicago architecture. There were dissenting voices, a few historians like Robert Bergman of the University of Illinois at Chicago, and architects like Stuart Cohen. But when John started working on his doctoral thesis, they were a minority within a larger scheme of things. This was the intellectual and scholarly milieu with which John found himself at the beginning of his doctoral work. John's scholarly reconstruction of the history of North Michigan Avenue was a bold step away from the view of what was important in the story of Chicago and how what was important should be evaluated. John focused on the urban ensemble, the avenue, instead of the individual buildings. He did discuss the buildings, but he framed the discussion of the architecture in urbanistic terms. Furthermore, he treated the architectural designs of the buildings such as the Wrigley Building, the London Guarantee Building, the Mania Club, and the Lakeshore Trust and Savings, among many others, not as ill-conceived copies of historical styles or failures of vision, but as noteworthy designs that enrich the urban promenade. Today, we say, of course they are important buildings. Of course the avenue is the building block of great urban design. But this is not always how people thought about Chicago, with its gridded street and towering engineering achievements. John understood Chicago, and he shared his understanding with generations of architecture students at the University of Notre Dame. Part of what John understood about the history of Chicago architecture is that in order to promote a fuller, richer appreciation of Chicago, he had to step away from the conventional way the history of Chicago architecture was framed when he began his career as an architectural historian. Chicago occupies a special place in the story of American architecture and urbanism. Here at Notre Dame, it is easy to take Chicago for granted. After all, 90 miles is almost next door. We send students far away to Rome for an academic year, to Europe and Asia on summer programs. We take students returning from Rome to Colonial Williamsburg in Washington, D.C., as part of their re-entry into the American scene. It is easy to forget people regularly travel thousands of miles to stand on a bridge over the Chicago River at Michigan and Walker, gaze in wonder at this intersection of the river and the boulevard with its iconic skyscrapers that mark the beginning of one of the great urban boulevards in North America, a boulevard we understand better and appreciate more, in no small part because of John Stamper's scholarship. Thank you.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to introduce and to welcome my colleague, Professor Alessandro Pirottini, in the context of our school's celebration of John Stamper's life and teaching. Like John, Alessandro is a passionate student of ancient Greek and Roman architecture. And like John, he understands history as a continuum in which every successive age is enriched by an understanding of those universal principles which are a thread that bind the generations. As most of you know, Professor Pirottini received his PhD in architectural history at La Sapienza University in Rome. His scholarly research centers primarily on the formal and technical aspects of Greek temple architecture. His dissertation, completed in 2015 focused on the first stone temples of Greece and their antecedents. His investigation of Greek temple architecture has included campaigns at the important sites of Isthmia and Corinth, with the support and assistance of the American School of Classical Studies at Athens, where he now serves as a voting representative to the managing committee. To cite a few recent accomplishments and activities by Alessandro, he's the founder and director of the Laboratory for the Interdisciplinary Study of Historical Architecture, or ISHA, at Notre Dame, which was established in the year 2000. He is a member of the University of Chicago excavation team at ancient Isthmia in Greece. His book on the early temple of Poseidon at Isthmia is currently in press. Prior to focusing on the Greek temple, Alessandro conducted research on the Pompeian house and its technical, formal, and iconographic aspects. Further studies conducted either as a research director or as a member of a research team include Roman architecture in North Africa and in the Eastern Mediterranean, Roman amphitheater design, and Etruscan funerary architecture. He has also participated in archaeological survey campaigns of Pompeian monuments led by Roma Tre University, including the Villa of the Mysteries and the Temple of Fortuna Augusta. The results of his researches have been presented internationally in conferences and lectures, including seminars in British, American, and Italian universities, such as Cambridge, the Pratt Institute of Design, the University of Miami, and La Sapienza and the Roma Tre universities. Please welcome Alessandro Piratini.
Richard said the expectation's too high. Well, I'll begin. John was a mentor at Notre Dame. I started here in 2015. I had worked in the Rome program for some more years before then. And beyond that, John and his family are our friends, so I'm particularly happy and honored with this opportunity to say a few words today. So, John Stamper's Roman temple. Yes, right into it. Now, John spent a long and significant part of his life in Rome. It was long, it was, as Michael said, about 10 years. He directed the Rome program back when it was there in Via Monterone. We all remember the building, smaller than the current one, but imbued with meaning for all of us. John said that, and meaningful, significant, his life in Rome was in many ways. The old saying goes that everyone should do three things in their lives: plant a tree, have a child, and write a book. No, because all those things live on after us. They are our legacy. And I don't know if John planted a tree while he was in Rome, but he certainly did the other two things. And his legacy survives in many forms. And an important form of this legacy, its academic legacy, scholarly legacy, has to do with the Roman architecture. Now, when he landed in Rome in 1990, John's previous focus as an architectural historian was not ancient architecture, as we've heard from many speakers today. He was an expert in modern Chicago architecture, American architecture of the late 19th and early 20th century architecture. But John's interests were not limited to one period and one place. And so unlike most architectural historians of his generation, and I would say my generation too, John was not only a historian, he was also an architect. And as such, he had a deep understanding of essential aspects of architecture, structure, construction, design, and as such, because he had that deep understanding of architecture, he was qualified to examine modern as well as ancient architecture with insight and originality. Now, John published a book on Roman architecture, architecture of the Roman temples in 2005. This book has influenced the scholarly debate on the discipline for ever since. And many of the questions that John asked in his book continue to inform the scholarly discussion of Roman architecture. And surely this book has been textbook and very influential for a whole generation of scholars, not only of Roman architecture, but of ancient architecture more generally. Now, to give you a very brief outline of John's approach to ancient Roman architecture, I will focus on one temple because it was central to John's book and John's thinking about Roman architecture more generally. It's that big temple on the Capitoline Hill on the left, the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus Capitoline. Now, this temple, built in 509 BC, finished in 509 BC, dominated Rome, as you can see, on top of the Capitoline Hill, much like the Parthenon would dominate Athens over half a century later on top of the Acropolis. It was much larger and far more lavish than any other building ever built on the entire Italian peninsula until that time. It was so important that, and it remained important throughout the history of Rome until it was finally destroyed by the Vandals, that it was frequently mentioned, as John showed us in his book, by many ancient authors, such as Livy, for example, who stated that the temple was so magnificent that it should be worthy of the King of gods and men, the Roman Empire, and the majesty of the site itself. Now, the site itself was had majesty for sure. It had been one of the most significant places of Rome ever since the time of Romulus. Before becoming the site of the greatest temple of Rome, the main temple of Jupiter in Rome, it had been a cemetery. And before then, it had already been a special sacred place, again, ever since the time of the mythical founder of Rome, Romulus. But what do we know about this temple? Very little, because very little of it, or virtually nothing of it, has survived above the ground. And as important as this temple was throughout the history of Rome, no scholars had really understood its importance for the ancient Romans before John Stamper got interested in it. Most of what we know about the temple, we know it from the ancient literary sources, such as, Livy, who recounts that the temple was built under and by Tarquinius Superbus, the legendary last king of Rome, an Etruscan king. And he goes on to say that Tarquinius planned to build the temple of Jupiter on the Tarpeian Mount, which we know to have been one of the peaks of the Capitoline Hill, to stand as a memorial of his reign in his name. Now, the Capitoline has continued to be one of the most significant places for the Romans throughout the history of the Eternal City. And as we all know, nowadays it houses the City Hall of Rome, the Palazzo Senatorio, and the other two Renaissance buildings on the left and right house the main archaeological museum of Rome. But what else do we know about the temple? Again, we know it was on the Capitoline Hill, on this Tarpeian Mount, but where exactly it was, where exactly this part of the Capitoline Hill was, is a question that has puzzled generations of scholars for many centuries. Until the middle of the 19th century, Luigi Canina, following previous studies of the 16th and 17th century, had restored the temple there in the circle at the northern end of the Capitoline Hill, right underneath the medieval church of Santa Maria in Araceli. But later excavations and research by Rodolfo Lanciani at the end of the 19th century demonstrated that the Tarpeian Mount was in fact at the southern end. And because he found actual parts of the foundations of the Temple of Jupiter, he was able to give a first reliable reconstruction of the plan of the temple. And further archaeological research of the 20th century has demonstrated that the temple was there, and has uncovered new and extensive parts of the original foundation. So that's the foundation. It sits right underneath the basement of the Palazzo Caffarelli, which is today one of the parts of the huge archaeological museum. Now, these foundations, we know for a fact that they belong to the temple. There are many foundations of the Capitoline Hill and around. These foundations match almost millimetrically, well, it's an exaggeration, but they match pretty closely the description given by Dionysius of Halicarnassus. It measured about 200 feet per side. So we know that belonged to the Temple of Jupiter. Here are the massive foundations that have been uncovered until today. Now, if you look at the human figure there, you can realize how massive they are. They total about 30, the known part of them totals about 30,000 cubic meters of finely cut blocks of the local tuff stone. And they sink at least 10 meters into the Capitoline Hill. Now, such massive foundations must have supported something truly colossal. But what did this temple look like? Well, everyone knows that the most typical, not the only one, but the most typical layout for temples had a cella in the center, surrounded by a colonnade of peristyle or peristasis on all four sides. But early Roman temples were different. In fact, they were inspired by Etruscan architecture. The Etruscans were a population that had originated perhaps in Asia Minor, but they had been in Italy for many centuries before Rome became Rome. And early Roman culture was imbued of Etruscan culture. There's no real break between the two cultures at the origin. And how do we know the main features of Etruscan architecture? We know because we have found several remains of several Etruscan temples all over the center and north of Italy. We also have Vitruvius's description of a typical Etruscan temple. And so we know that unlike their Greek counterparts, Etruscan temples had columns, yes, but only on the front, or in most cases on the front. And they had a in most cases, they had a tripartite cella at the back. They were built on tall podia with a staircase in front. And so, in short, they were designed to be seen from one preferential vantage point, unlike Greek temples. Now, based on what was known about Etruscan temples, and we know that the Temple of Jupiter was an Etruscan temple in many ways. Tarquinius Priscus was an Etruscan. The last king of Rome was overthrown and sent to exile after completing this temple. And then, as we all know, the founders of the Republic invested the temple with new meaning and made it one of the symbols of the newly born Roman Republic. So, based on what was known of the typical Etruscan temple, and based on the then known stretches of the original foundations of the temple, as well as on Vitruvius's description of Etruscan temples, Einar Gierstad in 1960 was able to reconstruct the temple. He reconstructed the plan of the temple of Jupiter. And ever since he did so, most scholars accepted, nearly all scholars of early Roman architecture accepted his reconstruction without questions. Now, most of those scholars were brilliant humanists, classicists, archaeologists, art historians. As a matter of fact, that thoroughly explored all of the relevant archaeological remnants of the temple, as well as the literary sources that described this temple. But none of them have really paused to understand the architecture of the temple. What do I mean by architecture? None of them had ever paused to understand what the huge scale of Gierstad's reconstructed temple meant in terms of the design, construction, and even more importantly, structural behavior of this huge structure. Now, to give you an idea, this is one of the colorful reconstructions of the temple of Jupiter Capitoline. To give you an idea of the scale of it, here it is compared to the great Parthenon of Athens. They were not at the same scale. Yes, wasn't it huge? Now, that was John Stamper's point when he got interested in this temple. It's too large. Its structure would not have worked with the, in particular, he claimed that he, with reason, that the huge, the heavy roof covered with the thick terracotta tiles would have exerted a load right on the middle of that 12 meters long architrave or lintel or beam. And we all know that that's the worst possible loading condition for a beam, let alone a beam so long that was in fact unparalleled in the whole, not only in early Roman architecture or early Greek architecture, but across the Mediterranean. Even if we include the humongous buildings of ancient Egypt, there is no parallel for such a long beam. And now this temple was at least twice as large as the Parthenon, and at least 3 times as larger than any other temple that had ever been built in the whole Italian peninsula until that period. So, interestingly enough, until John Stamper got interested in this temple in the 90s, nobody had ever explored the architecture of the building, the design, the structure, and the construction of the building. As a matter of fact, those questions, those aspects had surprisingly remained unexplored until John picked it up and applied his understanding of those aspects to ancient architecture. Now, he went on to propose more arguments of a similar fashion on this temple and on Roman architecture more generally. Some of the questions that he raised have found answers in the ensuing decades. Other questions that he posed are still awaiting convincing answers. And as a matter of fact, John's deep analysis of this temple and Roman architecture more generally has informed the discussion, the scholarly debate on Roman architecture ever since. Several of his questions still inform the debate on this particular temple, but the question is not settled. Now, John's approach combined a rigorous analysis of the historical sources with, as I said, the more architectural aspects of architecture. That's a repetition, I know, but that's not that obvious. His approach, combining the technical and the historical, has inspired a whole generation of scholars of antiquity, among whom myself. And one of the most distinguished of them is John North Hopkins, who teaches Roman architecture at the Institute of Fine Arts of New York University. Now, I believe was still a graduate student when he first met John Stamper at the annual meeting of the Society of the Architectural Historians a while ago. And ever since, this is his influential book of 2016. Perhaps you will recognize a piece of the plan of the Temple of Jupiter. He watched John's talk about on the Temple of Jupiter, and he got so passionate that became his career. And John Stamper became one of his mentors and guided him and helped him towards this very influential monograph that he published again in 2016. Now, only a few days after John Stamper prematurely left us, John Hopkins reached out to me, and he proposed that we join forces to continue John's work on the Temple of Jupiter. And I'm happy to say that beginning next semester, John Hopkins and I, and joined by a whole team of interdisciplinary team of architects, engineers, archaeologists, and graduate students of Notre Dame and other institutions will undertake this new exciting project. Now, John Stamper has mentored many of us. He has helped us. He has inspired many of us. And we will certainly do our best to continue his legacy. Thank you.
Thank you, Alessandro. I think we're going to take a break, because as is customary in these events, we run a little late. So perhaps a 15-minute break is opportune at this time. As schedule had suggested we take one about this time. So we'll stretch our legs again and come back. So we'll come back and we'll begin with Norman Crow's presentation, and then continue with the panel discussion and final remarks. So, thank you. Don't be late, 15 minutes.
Hello, so we are going to get started now. So it is my privilege to introduce one of the wisest and most caring people I know. Norman Crow is an architect who lives in Albuquerque, New Mexico. He holds a degree in architecture from the University of Oregon and Cornell University, and is emeritus professor at Notre Dame, where he taught courses in design, urbanism, environmental issues, and was the founding director of the school's graduate program in architecture. He was the University of Illinois Plym professor in 2003, and most recently taught graduate seminars at the University of Mexico, focused on historic preservation and regionalism. His books he has written include Visual Notes for Architects and Designers, co-authored with Paul Lasso, Nature and the Idea of the Man-Made World for MI Press, Building Cities Towards a Civil Society and Sustainable Environment, co-edited with Michael Lakutis and Richard Economakis, and Travel Sketches of John McHugh. And he has written numerous journal articles over the years. His professional and teaching activities include architectural practice in Ithaca, New York, London, Sweden, plus collaborative urban design projects with students for South Bend, Indiana, Vesoul, Portugal, Sidon, Lebanon, and Las Vegas, New Mexico. And he conducted summer teaching programs in Japan and has taught in Notre Dame's Rome Studies program. One of the things that I always think of with Norm is how his work has really given us permission to see the intersection between nature and the man-made world. At a time when sustainability was thought about hugging trees and building was thought as isolated to urban areas, he combined the two and has inspired all of us. So thank you for coming back. It was wonderful to have you.
Thank you, Marianne. When I stopped to think about John and when we first met, my thoughts go back to when we recruited him at Notre Dame. Robert Amico, who was chairman of architecture at the time, came to me and he said, there's this guy named John Stamper, and I have no idea how Bob Amico came to know about him, but said that he has all the perfect credentials for what we need right now in the School of Architecture. But I'm having a hard time interesting him in coming here, because it's like coming home to him. He's from around here. So he said, would you help me twist his arm and think about coming? And knowing Bob Amico, he might have been quite literal about that. So we talked with him, and I recall telling him that regardless of the fact that we're in bad budget situations and low faculty, and we're in a very good university context, and it bodes well for the future. And I said to him, you'll love teaching Notre Dame students. It's the right experience to get started. And of course, he stayed, and we're all so fortunate for his having done so. I'm feeling all the more fortunate thinking back over all the times I've had, all the good times I've had working with him, which has been so inspirational, I think, for all of us. I'm going to talk about something that'll sound to be quite a bit tangential at first, but I think it'll come back around, and you'll see how I relate it to John. And by the way, I just got over a cold, and my voice doesn't sound so good, but bear with me if you would. When I first entered the building, this is my first time here, by the way, and I see that there's a framed photograph of Jane Jacobs, and it seems so appropriate to have that hanging in the School of Architecture, and I'll talk about that. I'll also suggest that you might consider hanging a portrait of Rachel Carson next to it, or nearby, or at the other end of the atrium. Because I see them as two sides of the same coin, and I'll explain what I mean by that. Jane Jacobs and Rachel Carson stand together for having warned us about the consequences of our actions. For Jacobs, as you well know, it was about what we were doing to our cities, and for Carson, it was about what we were doing to nature. Jacobs knew that more parking places, traffic lanes, and suburban sprawl, among other unchallenged planning priorities of the times, was leading to the destruction of humane cities, while Carson showed us that our disregard for the cumulative effect of a blind infatuation with high-tech so-called solutions to managing agriculture was causing cascading environmental destructions beyond agricultural alone. Both of them, in other words, showed us that we must stop treating complex, interconnected things as though they operated independent of everything around them. And I'm going to show how John Stamper also helped to show us that same thing. These two women spoke out more than 60 years ago, and for all I know, they never met, and certainly their arguments weren't seen at the time as being at all related to one another. But today, we can see those arguments as being, I would call it, two sides of the same coin. Jacobs' book, Death and Life of Great American Cities, came out in 1961, became the 20th century's most significant influential writing on the subject of urbanism, and Carson's The Silent Spring in the very next year, 1962, was the century's most foremost effective, influential book about environmental destruction caused by our collective negligence. Since the publication of each of these seminal works, as you all know, a lot has happened, a lot has changed. Carson wasn't aware of global warming, and Jacobs couldn't have imagined the huge increase in urban populations that has taken place around the world. Today, we have the advantage of hindsight, as well as the more immediate and sometimes visceral accumulated evidence of the long-term consequences of what both Jacobs and Carson warned us about. From Carson, everything we create is made of materials from nature, and everything we do has an impact on natural processes. And from Jacobs, every decision about cities impacts the lives of citizens, no matter how remote or detached it may seem. Carson showed us that toxins travel through food chains to affect species far beyond intended target organisms. And Jane Jacobs demonstrated, as you all well know, that planning policies having to do with transportation impact human communities in profound ways, even when they weren't meant to do so in the first place. That's the lesson of history as well, something which John Stamper frequently reminded his students, and it's verified by contributions from the full range of disciplines, and especially from science. For instance, British scientist James Lovelock's Gaia hypothesis describes our planet and its complex ecosystem as an integrated, interactive whole. He asks us, in other words, to imagine that Earth as a living, breathing thing, in effect, a life form, whole and complex in the lifeless vacuum of space. That might actually be seen as an old-fashioned way of looking at life on the Earth. It squares with various traditional societies even today, including those in New Mexico, where I now live, who occupy the 19 pueblos that remain from the time of the shift in population in New Mexico to the Rio Grande Valley. And it also squares with Ionian philosophers of ancient Greece, Anaximander and Anaxagoras, I believe. Lovelock goes on to say that we need a new paradigm, or myth, or story, or metaphor, to sense what's going on and how we're all part of it. It's not sufficient to see scientific, historical, and anecdotal evidence alone, one at a time, but to feel or sense it all together. Lovelock's hypothesis is named Gaia, the primal Greek goddess of all living things, a metaphorical reference to an ancient myth that we don't necessarily believe in anymore. But he emphasizes the importance of thinking in metaphor as a means to an all-inclusive understanding of things. Here's how he put it. He says, and I quote, "Metaphor is important because to deal with, understand, and even ameliorate the fix that we're now in over global climate change requires us to know the true nature of the Earth. Unless we see the Earth as a planet that behaves as if it were alive, and at least to the extent of regulating its climate and chemistry, we will lack the will to change our way of life and to understand that we have made it our greatest enemy. That is, our way of life has now become our greatest enemy." End the quote. The fix we are in, as he puts it, is the result of a that has seen enormous success until comparatively recently, historically speaking. But now we realize that attitude has to change. I'll quote him again. "The concept of Gaia, a living planet, is for me the essential basis of a coherent and practical environmentalism. It counters the persistent belief that the Earth is a property and a state there to be exploited for the benefit of humankind. If we apply what he says to cities and architecture, it means that we must change how we think both about nature and cities, because the built environment is indeed a part of nature, along with everything else. Not long ago, as I understand it, Boston architect Michael Dennis was here to talk about how cities and the things we build must be seen as critical to correcting what Lovelock calls, and I quote, the fix we're now in. Once again, Michael's approach emphasizes how things are connected to one another. If you don't know Michael's recent book, by the way, Architecture in the City, I strongly recommend it. It provides plenty of graphs and charts from scientific observations that verify and emphasize what he has to say, and he provides comparative renderings of urban situations that demonstrate how adapting cities to mitigate climate change is at the same time to make them more habitable and more humane. And as you may know, he brings that home by using South Bend, Indiana as one of his examples, and I presume he presented that when he was here recently. Michael doesn't speak of the necessity of a new paradigm to override all of this, but I see that as implicit in what he has to say. And I'll argue that the major piece of the puzzle towards solving the way we think about nature and the built environment, which is something that is actually something that's ongoing here at Notre Dame, and you might be so familiar with it and so much a part of it, and you don't realize what a wonderful thing you actually have about it. By way of explanation, what I mean by that. When the Notre Dame School of Architecture's graduate program was 3 or 4 years old, and I was its director, we arranged for an outside evaluation as required by the university to serve as a critique of our intents and our effectiveness of implementing those intents. Doug Kelbaugh, then Dean of the School of Architecture at the University of Michigan, was selected as the outside review committee's chairperson. He responded very positively to the program here at Notre Dame, especially in relation to its context in a school that uniquely emphasized classicism in architecture. In his evaluation, he made a somewhat tangential statement, tangential, almost Zen-like, I think, in the long run, which I've mulled over ever since. He said that, quote, classicism is a closed system. And we should emphasize that to distinct advantage in these times of environmental and urban crisis. By the way, I haven't asked him what he really meant by that, and I should do that sometime. To do so, let me explain that by reading a comment or definition by classical Greek scholar Edith Hamilton for her explanation of what she calls the ancient Greeks' way of thinking. And I quote, "A house is a very complicated matter considered by itself. Plan, decorations, furnishings, each room indeed made up of many things. But if it is considered as a part of a block or part of a city, the details sink out of sight. Just as a city in itself is a mass of complexity, but it's reduced to a few essentials when it's thought of as belonging to a country." That way of thinking, as she calls it, is sometimes referred to as the Temenos paradigm. Temenos, of course, usually refers to the sacred precinct of a temple. Conceptually, it isolates the temple from all else, while at the same time, each sacred temenos is part of a city's fabric, while the city is part of the countryside, and the countryside is part of the broader region, and so forth. Everything is unique, while at the same time, always part of something larger. In other words, its context. Details or parts of a classical building are exemplary of that very way of thinking. Each part is distinct, while at the same time, it relates to all the other parts in scale, character, proportion, relationships, and so forth. Column, capital, entablature, pediment, molding, cornice, and so on. You all know about this. All serve to unify the whole, while each is a distinct thing in itself. Recall, for instance, Vitruvius' statement that emphasizes how architecture must always be consistent with the ways of nature, as it's translated. It's not just a way to make architecture, but it's part of a way of thinking. If you stop to compare, such an explanation is consistent with a biologist's description of an ecosystem, or at a more comprehensive scale, Lovelock's description of the Earth's biosphere as a living thing in his Gaia hypothesis, or, if I may, Andres Duane's and others' descriptions of the urban transect, which itself is derived from biology in the first place. Certainly a lot more might be said about this, but I'll leave it here for you to mull over, much as I suppose I mulled over Doug Kelbaugh's enigmatic statement about the role of classicism and the program of graduate studies in architecture and urbanism at Notre Dame. A new way of thinking, if I may call it that, has to be more than what I've described here. Of course, it must counter what Lovelock refers to as the persistent belief that the earth is a property and a state there to be exploited for exclusively commercial purposes. John Stamper, as I recall, always encouraged his students to look into the deeper meaning behind what they see before them. We've come to a time in urban history, in human history, when we must act to avert catastrophe, and refining a new way of thinking, a new way of seeing things, strengthened by means of a new myth or story or metaphor or paradigm as inspiration, must be part of that. I'll close by citing these two books by John Stamper. Chicago's North Michigan Avenue, it's been presented so well by others here. And in the last presentation, The Architecture of Roman Temples, the Republic to the Middle Empire. When taken together, these two books register the breadth of John's overall view of architecture and his scholarly efforts to draw together what would otherwise be considered quite disparate things. Except for the fact that each is about architecture, their subjects would seem to be completely unrelated, as dissimilar as Jane Jacobs' Life and Death of Great American Cities and Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. But just as these two works are ultimately two sides of the same, those two works are ultimately two sides of the same coin, Stamper's books are very clearly related to one another at a much more profound level. Each deals with the role of typology in architecture, as well as the relationship of the evolution of architectural ideas to cities and their embodied cultures, including their economies. For North Michigan Avenue, it was economics and commercial real estate entangled with architecture and urban values. And for his book on Roman temples, it was the influence of one temple in particular, as we were just shown, the temple of Jupiter Capitolinus, and its relationship to subsequent Roman temples in a succession over the centuries. Not to belabor the point, but I think it important to point out that John's approach to architecture and architectural history was remarkably inclusive. He found correspondence and relationships in just about everything. That, I think, was the strength of his scholarship, a primary strength of his scholarship. It held it all together, and he passed that on to his students. He didn't belabor the point of the relationship between the built environment and nature, as I do, I suppose. But if you consider the breadth of his inclusive view of architectural and urban history, it was entirely implicit in his scholarly approach. Thank you very much.
I invite our panelists to come up. Norm? You are on our panel.
My name is Norm Santo.
Oh, is it?
That's all right.
Excellent. Well, thank you. Thank you, Norm, for that talk, and everybody today for such an engaging and wide conversation about the depth and breadth of John's career, his scholarly engagement, his teaching, even his administrative work. I'd like to start today because the panel, it has a range of experiences with John. I am very fortunate to have been a student, a colleague, and a friend. I met John in Rome when I was on the Rome program. He was writing his book at the time. We were very fortunate as students. He would assign different temples every year, and at the beginning of the class say, if you've drawn one of these well, I'm going to retire it and assign a different one next year. And that was how he illustrated his book. And it was always, everybody sat up a little straighter thinking, if I draw this drawing really well, I might get in the book. I'm proud to say I actually did make it in the book, which was extraordinary. I came back to Notre Dame and met him as a colleague. And while you may know me for designing little Katrina cottages with little sash windows, I was actually moved from Miami where I was living in a 57-story high-rise. So he immediately took to me, and we built a friendship over our love of, actually I love living in a high-rise and drawing little sash windows through the wall of glass. And then eventually had just some really lovely dinners with Erica and John talking about architecture and history. I always felt like I needed to bring a notebook during dinner, although that would have felt inappropriate. So luckily sometimes he would follow up with things afterwards. So it was really wonderful. I would love to open up to the panel, and for everybody, we just go down the panel and say how you engaged with, okay, well, I'm gonna hand this to you, there you go. Your relationship evolving as it may have been with John, and a few thoughts and a little bit about yourself and where you are today.
Polly Cruchet here. I'm a faculty member of the School of Architecture. Been here 17 years, sorry about this. I knew this was gonna happen, that's why I wanted them to start with. Got to know, actually Michael got me here, and Isa and Michael brought me to the school and made me feel welcome in a time where they knew that South Bend is a very difficult place to live in, and they still wanted to make sure that we feel at home coming from Germany. And all these people who spoke today, you know, Norm, John, all these are mentors. These are people that have been in my life as someone who came at the age of 25, not knowing what it means to be a faculty member here, and helping me grow in my profession to a large degree, I'm sorry. And each time supporting and holding my hand as I went through the whole process. Over years, we became good colleagues, and in the final years, even more strongly getting to know him as a friend, and getting to know Erica as a friend. And it's very difficult, and I know it's beautiful in many ways to celebrate him today, but it's also very difficult to imagine what it means to have someone who has been 17 years beside you, helping you grow, see you become the person you have become, and continue to support you so long. So thank you.
Okay, hello everybody. My name is Margaret Jen, and I was very fortunate to be John's student and his friend as well, and also Erica and Alessandra. So I came to the US in the 2012 as a college freshman without any previous experience abroad, and I, as you might know, I felt a bit of like an outsider, and everything that I'm not familiar with, and my English was not good at that time. But knowing John from our first year architectural history class, I sense his caring of his students, no matter where they came from, and no matter how awkward they speak, how awkwardly they spoke. And this kind of caring, like treating a friend or a family member, really helped me to get past my first 2 years here at Notre Dame. I told my parents that I felt being taken care of, I felt like home. I don't I couldn't imagine that if it was not John and other Professor Arnold Dame, I would feel so lonely, and this kind of being an outsider in the US will affect me later on. But one particular thing in the architectural history class is that John introduced architecture outside the Northern classical Greek Roman traditions. And he treated those architecture similarly as equal to be honored, to be valued as a part of the whole architectural culture that the whole world shared. And he helped me to establish a link and extend my ability to think beyond a particular architecture style or a particular way of thinking as an architecture student, to help me to think further beyond what I have learned as a student at Notre Dame. He helped me to establish a braver mindset than I could ever imagine, to venture far beyond classical architecture, beyond Western tradition, to see, and also even beyond architecture design itself, to see the links, to see the connection of all the disciplines in a college, like with the computers, with the artificial intelligence even, and also with the tools we use. I think John helped us, like Eva and Jackie said before. He helped us to really think and to learn according to our own interest and passion, to see the world as we wished and as we hope to see the world as it is. And he also encouraged me to apply for a computation program at MIT, and he encouraged me to further extend what I am capable of, and to let's say to continue my education as an architect here at Notre Dame, to continue this mentality of thinking about people, caring about the world, to other disciplines like the computers, and really carry this way of doing things, of teaching, caring, and also befriending what we have all together. Yeah, thank you.
I'll be brief since you guys have already been introduced to me earlier, but was able to experience Professor Stamper's wonderful mentorship, both in his history of architecture classes, as so many have mentioned, as well as both high-rise and thesis studios. And again, as we've mentioned so many times, it's just incredible to hear so many people in this room talking about the incredible mentorship that he provided to each and every one of us, and the incredible care that he, an investment he made in each and every one of our students, and the stories that we're all able to share coming out of that experience.
Hello, my name is Ava. I graduated 2019, and so like Jackie, Professor Stamper was very much at the heart of my education here at Notre Dame. I had him for both semesters of architectural history. I also did the high-rise studio, and I also had him as my thesis advisor. And my whole memory of him is very similar to what everyone has been saying today. He was always very encouraging, a wonderful mentor. Even to this day, I remember him coming to my projects, whether it was in high rise or in my thesis, and he would always come as I would explain, he would come with more questions for me to think about, and he really challenged my thought process and became kind of the heart of the way I think about buildings today. So I currently also work with Jackie. So I work with that high rise, and I kind of cemented what I learned from him, and I use it in my practice there. And I still use his teachings to this day.
Well, you already heard me tell of my experience when I first met John. One other thing quickly, one other experience comes to mind. I think people here have said a great deal, which all of which I agree with. It brings back such fond memories. I remember one humorous memory. John and I think we're both of the same frame of mind about administration. We did it because we knew we needed to do it to accomplish things, but that was neither the focus of either of our professional approaches to architecture and architectural education. But it was great working with John on administrative things for that reason. At one point, we had a series of meetings, I think it was 3 meetings with the provost in his office, John and I and the provost. And we wanted him to come to a certain conclusion about the School of Architecture, but we didn't want to just come right out and tell him that because that might not work. We wanted him to come to that conclusion on its own. So in the 3rd meeting, near the end of the meeting, the provost said what we wanted him to say. He came to that conclusion. And John and I had really manipulated him. and so we thanked him and agreed with him fully, of course. And we walked out of the meeting quietly from the main building and took the diagonal sidewalk to Bond Hall. And neither John nor I spoke to each other until we got about halfway there. And we just turned and looked at each other and laughed, and both gave each other a big high five. We did it. That was part of my enjoyment with working with John, certainly.
I think we're not finally technologically challenged, so yeah, I think today's discussions, talks, and sort of experiences that students and colleagues and friends have heard really show how far John's influence has gone throughout this university, throughout the world, as his students have gone spread all over the world. And all the international students that have come here, all 4 corners of this country, and his influence on the school is really remarkable. In no small way, Thomas Gordon Smith's arrival at Notre Dame was also due to John and to Norm and others. But John really has been a continuity throughout all of this time. And through his scholarship, his administrative duties and insights, his teaching, that's a lot for any human being to actually be able to accomplish in their life, because the psychological breadth and depth that is required for such a job is remarkable. And he did it without ever complaining, or if he did, we never knew it. And he did it with calmness and kindness, has been said time and time again today. We will really miss him in that respect. He was a friend, he was a colleague, and as someone once said, I'll quote her, his fingerprints went far more on thousands of people across the world. So I think that's he was my confidant when I was dean. And together we went through hard times and good times as the school had challenges and, all sorts of issues, from, the return of students from Rome, which was particularly painful during the COVID times, as well as other challenges, when the accreditation team didn't quite understand what we were doing. And, John's calmness and his, I was going crazy. Just, rah, 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 just complaining about the accreditation leader and having to, actually at one point, have some words with him. John kept it going smoothly. So in the course of the 30 years that I've known him, one looks back and looks at an extraordinary legacy that he has given, and that he found time for his family throughout all of this was truly the other piece of that isn't said as often as it should. But he was a remarkable family person. Alessandra and Erica, he devoted himself completely to them, and without ever making them feel like he was taking anything away from them or making us feel he was taking anything away from the school. He did it all seamlessly, just as he talked about skyscrapers and Roman temples all in one.
Beautifully said. For those of you that were colleagues, how did John's research intersect with yours or inspire yours? Wonderful colleague.
We just talked about the work he has done on the Roman temples. We would discuss at length quite a bit some of his findings on the Roman Forum. For the last 10 years I've been working on it, he was very inquisitive to find out what we knew. And he had a theory that he had put forward. His theory was that there are two temples in the Forum, the temple of Saturn and then the temple of Castor and Pollux. They look towards the Forum today, but his theory was that they actually looked outwards towards the Forum Borarium. And he had this whole idea that the Forum Borarium was such an important place for people to meet before the Forum became an important destination. And he wanted me to go in and look after when we were documenting the site, if I could find findings that reflect any of this understanding, or did it mean in any way what he was perceiving. And he had found this out through his writings and through work of previous scholars that he felt that there could be this theory in place. I was very inquisitive about it. No author that I knew about had talked about them facing the other way. And him saying that meant like, this is something interesting. And, similar to what was discussed before, this could be a groundbreaking understanding of how the Forum experience truly was originally, before it became this inward-looking plan that we know of today. Finding out more about it, one understands that the Temple of Saturn, Temple of Vesta, and then later Castor and Pollux are part of some of the original temples, or some parts of the foundations are originally from the times that we know of, that is the Etruscan time frame. Only parts of it, not the whole structure as we see it today. And the theory, if it is true, would actually mean that Forum Borarium was very important in the Etruscan time frame than the Forum itself. And so remains to be seen as we continue the research if this is truly the possibility. But if done so, it would be something that would be credited to John's legacy in many ways for the kind of work that he has done in the Forum. So thank you.
Amazing. And from student points of view, you went to a high-rise studio and now you design high-rises. Can you talk a little bit, even just in your daily, in your daily work, some things that you think of John in specific ways as you work?
Sure. I know one of the first items he had us do during our high-rise studio experience was study extensive precedents and then dive in. I've worked primarily on residential high-rise architecture, which is what our high-rise project was during my class year with Professor Stamper. And he had us dive into the units first. And that's a mentality that I feel carries into the work I do every day now. So easy to make a building that looks great from the outside. It's this great sculptural form, but if you're not thinking about it from the inside out and making those baseline units the true building blocks of that building, your baseline, and where you truly start your entire design experience from, it's not going to be a feasible building at the end. And as I was looking back through some of my early phase work from my my experience in the high-rise studio, I found a whole series of pages where I would have units just cut and pasted onto a plan to see how those could work with different building forms I was looking at. And I think a lot of, that's just one example of many of the mentalities and thought processes that Professor Stamper instilled in us that is an absolutely essential part of what I work on every day now.
So my experience, I think what was really amazing was that it wasn't that we had one building and the group of us would work together on one building. It was each student worked individually on their own building, and doing that for a high rise is a lot of work and there's a lot of issues that you have to think through in terms of structure, in terms of the curtain wall, in terms of unit. You yourself are going through those motions, where at work, you're basically divided into a team of 6 or 7, and you have to kind of work with other people on those. So there are people who work more on the exterior, people who work more on the interior, more on the unit design. But having had that experience in that studio, when I currently do my job, I kind of internalize some of his comments and some of his recommendations, and I can look through those high rises and kind of have a better understanding because I had that experience before I started working.
That's fantastic. Margaret, you're pursuing a PhD right now. Could you maybe talk about how your working with John inspired that and your academic trajectory?
Oh, yeah, sure. So I think I will start with the high-rise studio too. I was very fortunate to be a part of that. I think the one thing that influenced me the most from the high-rise studio is the use of technology tools. So John will push us to get onto computer in the first month or even the first week. So yeah, so before that, I think we were hesitant to use computers because we thought that would be a conflict to our. But John made it. Again, he made a link. He taught us how to establish this link to use more technological approach to solve and look at the design, and also how to integrate to interweave those design methods or design thinking into the traditional method that we were more familiar with at that time. So I think this kind of mentality he set up for all of us in his studio really made me to start to think, will that be a further link between how we perceive, how we design architecture as a whole community of architects, or as a discipline of the design. So that's why I started to look at exploring the design process, that starting from my Notre Dame education, I look at how this whole set of design philosophy being interpreted or being explored in the more recent, say, conversations of human-machine relationships. And that's, so that was because the high-rise studio really got my confidence level up to not only use the machine as a tool, but to let me say befriend machine as a companion or as a trusted friend to approach to solve a design problem. So that's why it led me into the computation program at MIT. I finished my master's thesis last year, and this year I was very fortunate again to be admitted to the PhD program. And I think I will continue on this trajectory to to question and to explore, also to continue John's legacy of building up this precious link between the two very distant disciplines, and to see how it can serve human future in a better way, or in a way that Notre Dame had made me envisioned and wished.
So, Michael and Norm, I want to throw it back down to you guys. You've been colleagues over many years with John. You've both researched as well in parallel and side by side. One of the things that, and I think Michael, you just mentioned it, was that the calming and continuous sort of force that John brought to a constantly, as everything was changing, he was very steady. And I wonder if you might both elaborate on that and about his role in providing that steadiness at the school.
Hopefully, if I understand the question, to me, at least, John's scholarship was something that carried continuously on, and that I admired a lot. It could be applied, he could apply it to many different things, as I pointed out, to Roman temples or North Michigan Avenue, and come up with comparisons that you wouldn't have thought of. He was so disciplined about that, and I'm sure he loved doing it. He would become fully immersed in it, and I always admired him for that, and was inspired by it myself.
Well, when I first came to Notre Dame, Thomas was worried that I wasn't going to stay very long, so for various reasons. And so he sent me to Rome, and was where I met John again. I mean, like I said earlier, we were roommates in Jonesville, in Michigan, at our first faculty retreat. But the first thing he said was, "So what are you going to? What's your research like?" And I mean, I'd been working on Athenian neoclassical architecture, so I sort of talked about that. And well, what are you going to do after that? So, as he got me to thinking about the long-term issues that I would have to address as a faculty member, and even now, I got sucked into administration, not willingly, but I think it was God's way of punishing me for some sins I've done when I was younger. But through John, his example of how to start, restart, change directions of your agenda still helped me through figuring it out. What I'm working on now, and also his example of just doing it by using what you know, not always thinking that everything has to change 180 degrees, 360 degrees, whatever number you want to assign to it, but that life has more continuity and more consistency to it, even as things change around you. And I think that lesson that he taught us all over the course of these 3 decades, at least I've known him, have been truly remarkable lessons to have learned. And I'm sort of embarrassed to say that at my old age, I've learned them all over again. But John was one of the reasons why I learned them.
Polly, I wonder if you'd talk a little bit about some of John's recent work and his, especially South Bend book.
Yes. So in his final.
Just hold it closer, please.
Okay, sorry, now it's loud. Okay, so in his years that he was the associate dean, he was still continuing his research. So he started collecting 2 manuscripts. One that is on the city of South Bend and the historic context of the city of South Bend. And the other one was actually on Peston. And both these books were written to a large degree, completely ready and finished. And he would not publish them. He was just not ready to get them out. And as I became the associate dean for research, my job was to push people to get things done, right? So I was, John, let's take a sabbatical and get this done with. And John would be like, nope, I have to finish my administrative work. And I have all these things to do, and here are the 2 books. And I said, let's take your books and we're going to send it to a publisher. And surprisingly enough, he was very concerned that they are going to come back and actually tell him that they can't publish it. And that is one of the reasons he said he does not want to go forward. And Erica knows this very well. We sent it out to Princeton and to the Peston book to Princeton, and Princeton responded back saying they're very interested in publishing the book and he should get it completed and ready. This is the time, during the time he hadn't heard about his situation, and he had suddenly the next day a jump in his beat. He's like, was all enthusiastic and excited. I'm gonna get this book complete. And till the last minute, he was trying to get it complete. Dennis knows this, and I think Jennifer Parker knows this. We're going to do everything to make sure that his 2 books get published. So both those books are his contribution. And I know Erica still keeps on finding new books. So every time she comes back, she's like, I found another manuscript from him and I don't know where to go with it. But we're definitely going to try and get those published with the presses.
What haven't I asked?
Somebody's
Marianne?
Yes.
We have some wonderful students in the back that wanted to hear more stories
Okay.
about John Stamper, and stories also about Norm Crow.
I have a fun story. This is the time when it was deepest winter in South Bend, and Michael, Norman, and John would go for coffee in the morning. This is my introduction to the school, and they all had, who had the Russian hat? Michael had the Russian hat, or Norm had the?
I don't know, we both had Russian.
Yeah, I think you all had Russian hats. Not with what's happening right now, but the fact that there were big hats for winter to, produce you to be able to live in South Bend. And they would walk their way in this thick, beautiful, I remember this beautiful morning when it was sunny and there was a lot of snow, and the 3 figures that were my mentors walking back and forth, starting this legacy of coffee in the morning for me, and later on for Father, and for many of us that continued it from the 3 of you. So just a little quick memory.
Is this on? Okay, there we go. I was texting a few friends past couple of weeks saying, like, do you have any memories that you'd like to share? So one of my friends, she was in the same thesis studio, and as Jackie had mentioned earlier, the way that Professor Stamper kind of approached was that he would help you with what you're working on. And if you had something that you were struggling with, he would kind of stay with you until you figured it out. And one of the things that she was having trouble figuring out was her wall section. And so every day it was Professor Stamper would come to her and be like, okay, let's work this out. What are we doing? So they worked very vigorously on that wall section, to the point that at the end of that semester, when they give out all these wonderful awards, she was awarded for her wall section. So that is, I think, a testament to Professor Stamper's teaching, which is staying with you until you understand, and staying with you until you've solved the problem to the best possible solution.
Fantastic. Are there other questions from the room for anyone on the panel? Well, with that, then, thank you all for joining us on the panel. Thank you for your thoughtful remarks about John, his scholarship, his work, his being a colleague. It's really wonderful. Thank you all.
So, we're going to show a video now of John, an interview with John Stamper about the library mosaic, what is in the vernacular known as Touchdown Jesus.
The name of the mural, I think, is Touchdown Jesus. Touchdown Jesus. We need to share it. Touchdown Jesus, but I don't know if that's the official name.
The official name of the mural is the Word of Life.
Thinking of this as Touchdown Jesus, that's not in my mind, or anybody else's for that matter. And kind of a nice, friendly, familiar name for this beautiful piece of art.
The Word of Life mural on the Hesburgh Library is one of the most significant monuments on the Notre Dame campus.
We knew that if we didn't do something with this building, the enormity of it, the size, could be mistaken for a grain elevator or something.
Work of art. It measures 134 feet high by 68 feet wide.
Millard Sheets, who was the author of this particular mosaic, was one of the most wonderfully balanced, enlightened artists that I've ever met.
He was a painter, he was a sculptor, he was even an architect. So he was a really fascinating sort of Renaissance man in many ways. The theme of the mural, Christ the Teacher, was based upon a biblical passage, 1 John, the first chapter of John. And when Millard Sheets began his project, he sketched out a figure of Christ, then drew in a cross behind Christ, and then started drawing all of the prophets, the great figures in the history of Christianity. And he laid them out in kind of an ascending order. So that he started with the classical scholars, the Old Testament prophets, and moved upward on the mural to the Byzantine, the medieval, the Renaissance scholars. Christ is a very large figure that looms over all of them.
It's like a kaleidoscope of personalities that make up the history of Christianity and pre-Christianity as well. It's very rich philosophically and theologically.
Millard Sheets was very important for combining Impressionism with Cubism. And so you have the figures represented, but then there are these great lines that go across, that are inscribed across the mural. And that's a Cubist stylistic feature that he took from artists like Picasso and Matisse, for instance.
I'd say it's made of asbestos. I know the mural is made of granite. The mural is made up of granite from all over the world.
It has some 5,700 individual pieces of granite.
Granite, of course, is one of the hardest stones there is. The climate here is abominable. No one can say that would last.
Millard Sheets was able to get something like 140 or more different colors by using different kinds of granite. And he had to go to something like 16 foreign countries and 11 different states in the United States to find all of the different colors and all the different types.
He told me once that you can't cut granite on the curve. He said that was the myth. He got these young, bright workers and said, I want these things cut on the curve, just as I've drawn them. And these guys didn't know you couldn't cut on the curve, so they did. I'd say the face of Christ is about 30 feet.
10 feet?
15 meters. The face of Christ is 9 feet tall.
The head of Christ is made up of 115 different pieces of stone. That's one of the largest panels, and that's the most complex of all of them.
He did the whole thing, first of all, in one single picture, if you will.
A large-scale sketch of the final work is called a cartoon, and it's done at full scale, so that the pieces could actually be organized according to that cartoon.
I don't know where he got the piece of paper that big, but a big basketball floor just so he could see it.
When they assembled the work on the floor, they put these stainless steel dowels, and they coated all of it with plastic before covering it with cement. And when it was then installed on the building, there's actually space between the structural elements of the building and the mural itself, so that the whole thing can expand and contract and move very slightly during the changing seasons.
The amazing thing is that it has lasted this long and has kept the richness of its color.
The library was dedicated on May 7th, 1964. Hesburgh Library is very appropriate to the 1960s. It was a time when skyscrapers were very popular in the United States, and it was thought to be an important thing to do here at Notre Dame, to have a great high-rise building to sort of represent the times and the prosperity of the time.
It was going to be one of the 3 focal points in the university. When you drive up here, you see the spire of the church, you see the dome over the main building, and then you see the skyline and the mosaic from here. And that makes a wonderful kind of trilogy to locate the university in its right position.
Notre Dame has been called a place where the church does its thinking. And this mural, probably more than any other image on the campus, is a great symbol for that idea, the great academic tradition of Notre Dame.
Well, it's been left up to me to end this beautiful day. But I also wanted to give them a chance, if anyone wanted to say anything, students, faculty, staff, an opportunity to do so. Yes, in the back.
Thank you for the opportunity. My name is Eugenia Apto, and I'm an online parent. I'm blessed to hear the name John Stamper. The first time my daughter was enrolled, he called me and asked me to come and get a package for scholarship. Everybody has mentioned that. So I'm honored to be here to speak on behalf of his legacy and his caring and his passion and family oriented. So I didn't meet him. I went to the School of Architecture, the old building, and I was handed the envelope. But then my curiosity wanted to see who Stamper is all about. So I keep asking, I keep calling, hey, Priscilla, did you meet her? Did you meet him? And finally said, I said, if he's standing here, I wouldn't know who is Professor Stamper. And just to offer my gratitude and thanksgiving, I said, Priscilla, is for you, so you go do everything you will have to do to go on. I'm a single parent raising 2 kids. Her sister was also a St. Mary student, and at the same time. But finally, I get to meet him, and I didn't remember much, but it's just calm and collected. The second time I met him was at one of the professors who is a language, Italian language, professor whose husband died, so the art was exhibition.
Giovanna Sandusky?
I think so, yes. So that's when I met him in person, and then as we talked briefly, I said, would you like to come home for a dinner? And to my surprise, he said, okay. And so I gave him the information and waiting, and that one day the phone rang. Who would like to come this day? I said, okay. So I gathered myself and I have a broken ankle. I said, no, I have to do this. And he said, is it okay I come with my wife? I said, absolutely. And that evening was wonderful. Everything he said afterwards, I remember he said, no, it's my student. I got to talk to my student. I got to take the picture with the student. So I was out of order. It's about the student. And they spent more than 5-6 hours in my small apartment in Niles. So I'm blessed to be honored. I received a call yesterday from a friend of Erica who said, the reception is today, and I looked at my calendar. Right now, I'm not in Niles, I'm in Kalamazoo, but I look at my calendar, I said, no, I have to be here. And I'm blessed to have been a part of Notre Dame experience. Second year, I was able to volunteer, and I did continue until the COVID. And every year, I have to find my way. A new building, getting into it, it's all about architecture. They look the same, so where was I? Where was I? For the past 5 years, as she graduated, even 6 years, I let her come back to volunteer. 6 years when I get my foot grounded, knowing here because of the volunteering. But still, you come back again, there's a new building, but at least I know one way or the other. But I'm blessed to know him and the family, and my condolences to both of the family left behind, and his legacy will stay with me as a family man. Thank you.
Are there any other comments anybody would like to share before we conclude and go to the reception, which is outside in the Stoa, in the area we call the Stoa?
Michael.
Oh, yes, John. Yeah.
I'm John Miller. I'm on the faculty here. I have actually a long history in the program, undergraduate, graduate degrees from Notre Dame. John was the Rome director when I was in Rome, and everything that was said about him today absolutely rings true with me. But the thing that I want to make sure everybody knows is just how human he was, and how expensive it was to live in Rome, and how he recognized my struggles while I was there financially. He gave me a job. A steam job. I was a janitor in the studio so that I could make some money in order to stay in Rome. He bailed me out more than once when I ran out of money, gave me money out of his own pockets to make sure that I did not go hungry. I had the privilege of carrying his luggage when we traveled. This is before suitcases had wheels. John frequently traveled with books. But I remember all of it fondly, and I would never have survived without him. And I count him as a friend and a colleague and somebody that I miss very much.
Is there anyone else? Did you want to say?
Yeah. My name is Matt Money. I've been on staff with the School of Architecture for 9 years. I've done events and operations, and most of where I sat was in the Dean Suite with Michael and John and Barb. So we became very close. John, it was lovely to get to know him and work with him. I got to travel a ton with John, and we got with traveling became had events, and events had wine. So I got to we drank a lot of Sauvignon Blanc with John. So very fortunate for all those times and all those stories with him. So tonight at the reception, there's Sauvignon Blanc. So we have to toast John when we're drinking that. One other thing, at the events, Michael, the dean, always spoke, and I've heard a lot of his speeches, and so is John. And we would sit, and Michael he had one story that he told a few times. It was about you all know this, you've heard the story several times. It was about how Notre Dame got the Rome program in the building, and how Frank Montana went. There's a lot of details. How Frank Montana came and took a bunch of cash and went over and got the Rome building. And John would whisper to me every time Michael said this, "That is not true." That's he would never tell Michael, but that is not how it went down. So, thank you for coming. I'm glad we can toast John after this.
I wasn't sure where you were going. But yes, indeed, the story I was told. I don't remember who exactly told me this story, but I was told would start taking students to Rome on a volunteer basis. It was a summer program, and Frank thought that all students should go to Rome, and it should be a mandatory program. So he had rented some space. I think some people say it was an automobile repair shop. I don't know. That was way before my time. But he was walking down Via Monterone, where the program had been for many, many years. And he saw a for sale sign on the side of the building. And so he walked to the nearest tabacchi, which had a phone, and he called the number on the big sign. And the real estate agent comes trotting out and shows Frank Montana the space. And Frank says, "Great, I'll take it." So he comes back to South Bend and he sees Father Hesburgh, who you just saw here, and Father Ned Joyce, who held the purses of the university. He was very good friends with them, by the way. He says, "Father Ted, Father Ned," or Red Ned, he probably called them, "Guess what I just did? I bought us a building in Rome." And Ted says, Father Ted says, "You can't do that, Frank." "Oh yeah, here, it's the papers are signed and everything." So, and then Portia Prebes, who was the director at St. Mary's for many, many years, confirmed that story to me. John always said it wasn't true, it was slightly different. And I believe it because we actually did lease the building before we bought it. So it was probably a little bit of urban myth, hyperbole and all that. It made a great story. So we all continued it. And I remember John would always get a little upset with me when I would repeat it. So I'm sorry, John. I'll stop saying it. I just want to thank everyone who came here today. I want to thank our speakers from far and near. Thank you for your insights. Thank you for your warmth, your thoughtful comments, and the emotion that has gone into today. It's been very, very powerful. And who have known John for all these years, these memories always continue with us and into the future. I want us to leave with just with many thoughts. I mean, many people spoke today and many things to think about. But John, this issue of two sides of the same coin that Norman brought up is really true. And in his world, it was like that bridge at over Michigan Avenue with the two pieces of Doric architecture on either side and the steel span in between. That was a beautiful allegory of how John led his life. A bridge, the nature and character of that bridge, and the calmness in which he did it that we've heard so much about. We live in very difficult times and in unsure times, probably as unsure as they have been for at least 70 or 80 years. And we will need all the goodwill, all the calmness and the steadiness and confidence that we can possibly muster to get through whatever that brings us. And when I think of how John did all that and how he flawlessly and elegantly and beautifully he did, he was an example to us all about how to keep ourselves focused and dedicated to the bigger project, which is this world. I want to thank John Stamper for being my friend and colleague for all of these years. And I want to thank Erica and Sandra for being here and everyone else. So let's go and drink to John's memory in the Stoa with Sauvignon Blanc.